Ping pong. Ohayo gozaimasu. Selamat pagi. Good morning. 早上好。早晨。大家好。What is good morning in Korean, huh? You know what? I should really start learning Korean at this rate. At this point in time. I should start learning Korean as well. Anyway, guys, nobody's here. That's fine. Nobody's ever here whenever I start the stream. Usually people come in like way late. That's why I'm like thinking, should I change my reading session? But then it will mess up my lunch hours. I'm trying to eat. I'm trying to be healthy, okay? And I like the, I mean, I don't like the fact that I have to wake up early, but it's good for me to wake up early. And I think I should continue waking up early. Just that, but then if I don't have any reasons to be awake early, then I don't know if I should wake up early. I don't know what I'm saying actually. But today, there's no chapters to this book. Just so you know, there's absolutely no chapters at all, and I'm like, I don't know when should I stop. So if I were to start 10 past 11, I'm gonna try to end at 10 past 1 p.m. Like just a good 2 hours. But I don't know whether it will, the chapter or the form, man, Kazuo Ishiguro is making it hard for me. Like, if it stops at around like 1 o'clock, then it's perfect. If it doesn't, I'll push up until the chapter or whatever it is ends. Because they don't go by chapter, they go by dates. Like, the first so-called chapter is October 1948. It's not chapter 1. So October 1948 is almost half of the book. It's almost. So what I'm thinking is that, oh my god, you see, that's the thing, it's not very. So October 1948 ran from page 7 to page 96, which is insane, absolutely insane. And then the next one is April 1949, running from page 99 to page 127, which is like super short, like very short. And then the next one is November 1949, and then I think that's the end of it. And 1949 runs from, November 1949 runs from 131, page 131 to page 206, which is also absolutely insane. So I'm like thinking, I think, you know what? I think I should. Oh my god. Today will be a longer day, I guess. I guess I will read October 1948 and April 1949. Because it's like April 1949 is kind of short. Yeah, and I can't really like stop in between properly because I don't like to stop in between chapters like without any reason. So I think even though today is going to be a longer day, I don't know, I'll see, because I have work to do. But maybe, you know what, okay, maybe we'll do this, okay? We'll just read October 1948. I think that should be enough for like 2 hours stream for that. And then on Monday, I'll read a bit longer. Monday is 9th. I don't have anything on 9th, I think. Nah, nothing on 9th. So I think 9th will be okay. Yeah, I think I'll just read October 1948. And that should be it. Because I surprisingly I have a lot of work to do today, and I'm more interested in earning actual money than to be earning no money on this platform. Not that my main purpose to open this platform is to earn money, but it's to have fun and read because I really like reading, and I want to set a time for myself to read like a few days a week, and kind of just slow down and enjoy the story instead of like doing work all the time and pushing myself to the limit. Anyway, I'm babbling, putting on lip balm. Lip balm is essential when you're reading, especially when I don't hydrate. I always forget to hydrate. Guys, you guys need to remind me to hydrate. I don't know if there's anyone in the stream right now, but I'm just talking to myself, right? So I just say to myself, please hydrate when I read, please. Okay, that's a very thick layer of lip balm. You know what's my favorite lip balm? The Japanese mentholated medicated lipstick XD. Quick relief for dry, chapped, cracked lips. You can get them from like Lawson, Watson, and Guardian nowadays easily. But last time I had to go to Japan to buy it, or like try to find it online for like super expensive. I mean, if you buy it at Watson and Guardian, they are still very expensive. More expensive than you buy it in Matsukiyo. Do you guys know what Matsukiyo is? Matsumoto Kiyoshi, a drugstore that I frequent whenever I go to Japan. Except that I can't frequent it anymore because I don't go to Japan anymore because of this fucking pandemic, which make everything so much more expensive, and I have no money to do that. Without further ado, we shall start our reading. Okay? Since nobody's here anyway, I'm gonna start. I'll do whatever I want, man. Seriously. If you guys missed the beginning, you guys missed the beginning. It's not my fault. Alrighty. Okay, nobody's here. I'm gonna rely on... Okay, yeah, I brought Chewy out today. Let's... What the fuck? Drink coffee? Hand poured coffee? The best coffee in the world? Where is it? Oh my god. I also had my own personal hand poured coffee today. Anyway, let's read. One sip of tea. Today I had genmaicha, my favorite tea. Okay. Today we are reading Kazuo Ishiguro's An Artist of the Floating World. Published in 1989. Oh. Alright, we shall start now. October 1948. If on a sunny day you climb the steep path leading up from the little wooden bridge, still referred to around here as the Bridge of Hesitation, you will not have to walk far before the roof of my house becomes visible between the tops of two ginkgo trees. Even if it did not occupy such a commanding position on the hill, the house would still stand out from all others nearby, so that you come up the path, you may find yourself wondering, what sort of wealthy man owns it? But then, I am not, nor have I ever been, a wealthy man. The imposing air of the house will be accounted for, perhaps, if I inform you that it was built by my predecessor and that he was none other than Akira Sugimura. Of course, you may be new to this city, in which case the name of Akira Sugimura may not be familiar to you, but mention it to anyone who lived here before the war, and you will learn that for 30 years or so, Sugimura was unquestionably amongst the city's most respected and influential men. If I tell you this, and when arriving at the top of the hill, you stand and look at the fine cedar gateway and the large area bound by the garden wall, the roof with its elegant tiles and its stylishly carved ridgepole pointing out over the view, you may well wonder how I came to acquire such a property, being as I claim a man of only moderate means. The truth is, I bought the house for a nominal sum, a figure probably not even half the property's true value at that time. This was made possible owing to the most curious, some may say foolish, procedure instigated by the Sugimura family during the sale. It is now already a thing of some 15 years ago. In those days, when my circumstances seemed to improve with each month, my wife had begun to press me to find a new house. With her usual foresight, she had argued the importance of our having a house in keeping with our status, not out of vanity, but for the sake of our children's marriage prospects. I saw the sense in this, but since Setsuko, our eldest, was still only 14 or 15, I did not go about the matter of any urgency. Nevertheless, for a year or so, whenever I heard of a suitable house for sale, I would remember to make inquiries. It was one of my pupils who first brought it to my attention that Akira Sugimura's house, a year after his death, was to be sold off, and that I should buy such a house seems absurd, and that I should buy such a house seemed absurd, and I put the suggestion down to the exaggerated respect my pupils always had for me. But I made inquiries all the same, and gained an unexpected response. I received a visit one afternoon from two haughty, grey-haired ladies who turned out to be the daughters of Akira Sugimura. When I expressed my surprise at receiving such personal attention from a family of such distinction, the elder of the sisters told me coldly that they had not come simply out of courtesy. Over the previous months, a fair number of enquiries had been received for their late father's house, but the family had in the end decided to refuse all but 4 of the applicants. These 4 applicants had been selected carefully by the family members on grounds purely on good characters and achievement. It is of the very first importance to us, she went on, that the house our father built should pass to one he would have been approved of and deemed worthy of having it. Of course, circumstances oblige us to consider the financial aspect, but this is strictly secondary. We have therefore set a price. At this point, the younger sister, who had barely spoken, presented me with an envelope, and they watched me sternly as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank out, but for a figure written elegantly with an ink brush. I was to express my astonishment at the low price, and then saw from the faces before me that further discussion of financials would be considered distasteful. The elder sister said simply, "It will not be in the interest of any of you to try to outbid one another. We are not interested in receiving anything beyond the quoted price. What we mean to do from here on is to conduct an auction of prestige." They had come in person, she explained, to ask formally, on behalf of the Sugimura family, that I submit myself, along, of course, with the other three applicants to a closer investigation of my background and credentials. A suitable buyer could thus be chosen. It was an eccentric procedure, but I saw nothing objectionable about it. It was, after all, much the same as being involved in a marriage negotiation. Indeed, I felt somewhat flattered to be considered by this old and hidebound family as a worthy candidate. When I gave my consent to the investigation and expressed my gratitude to them, the younger sister addressed me for the first time, saying, "Our father was a cultured man, Mr. Ono. He had so much respect for artists. Indeed, he knew of your work." In the days that followed, I made enquiries of my own and discovered the truth of the younger sister's words. Akira Sugimura had indeed been something of an art enthusiast who on numerous occasions had supported exhibitions with his money. Hey! Morning. Sip of tea. I also came across certain interesting rumors. A significant section of the Sugimura family, it seemed, had been against selling the house at all, and there had been some bitter arguments. In the end, financial pressures meant a sale was inevitable, and the odd procedures around the transaction represented the compromise reached with those who had not wished the house to pass out of the family. That there was something high-handed about this arrangement that there was no denying, but for my part, I was prepared to sympathize with the sentiment of a family with such a distinguished history. My wife, however, did not take kindly to the idea of an investigation. "Who do they think they are?" she protested. "We should tell them we want nothing further to do with them." "But where's the harm?" I pointed out. "We have nothing we wouldn't want them to discover. True, I don't have a wealthy background, but no doubt the Sugimuras know that already, and they still think us worthy candidates. Let them investigate. They can only find things that will be to our advantage." And I made a point of adding, "In any case, they're doing no more than they would if we were negotiating a marriage with them. We'll have to get used to this sort of thing. Besides, there was surely much to admire in the idea of an auction of prestige, as the elder daughter called it. One wonders why things are not settled more often by such means. How so much more honorable is such a contest, in which one's moral conduct and achievement are brought as witnesses rather than the size of one's purse." I can still recall the deep satisfaction I felt when I learned that the Sugimuras, after the most thorough investigation, had deemed me as the most worthy of the house they so prized. Certainly. One moment, please. Adjusting my microphone. And certainly, the house is one worth having suffered a few inconveniences for. Despite its impressive and imposing exterior, it is inside a place of soft, natural woods selected for the beauty of their grains, and all of us who lived in it came to find it most conducive to relaxation and calm. For all that, the Sugimura's high-handedness was apparent everywhere during the transactions, some family members making no attempts to hide their hostility towards us, and a less understanding buyer might well have taken offense and abandoned the whole matter. Even in the later years, I would sometimes encounter by chance some members of the family who, instead of exchanging the usual kind of polite talk, would stand there in the street interrogating me as to the state of the house and any alterations I had made. These days, I hardly ever hear of the Sugimuras. I did, though, receive a visit shortly after the surrender of the younger of the two two sisters who had approached me at the time of the sale. The wars had turned her into a thin, ailing woman. In the way characteristic of the family, she made scant effort to hide the fact that her concern lay with how the house, rather than its inhabitants, had fared during the war. She gave only the briefest of commiserations on hearing about my wife and about Kenji, before embarking on questions concerning the bomb damage. This made me bitter towards her at first, but then I began to notice how her eyes would roam involuntarily around the room, and how she would occasionally pause abruptly in the midst of one of her measured and formal sentences, and I realized she was experiencing waves of emotions at finding herself back in this house once more. Then, when I surmised that most of her family members from the time of sale were now dead, I began to feel pity for her and offered to show her around. The house had received its share of the war damage. Akira Sugimura had built an eastern wing to the house comprising 3 rooms connecting to the main body of the house by a long corridor running down on one side of the garden. This corridor was so extravagant on its length that some people have suggested Sugimura built it, together with the east wing, for his parents, whom he wished to keep at a distance. The corridor was, in any case, one of the most appealing features of the house. In the afternoon, its entire length would be crossed by the lights and shades of the foliage outside, so that one felt one was walking through a garden tunnel. The bulk of the bomb damage had been to this section of the house, and as we surveyed it from the garden, I could see Miss Sugimura was close to tears. By this point, I had lost all of my earlier sense of irritation by the old woman, and I reassured her as best as I could that the damage would be repaired at the first opportunity, and the house would be once more as her father had built it. I had no idea when I promised her this. I had no idea when I promised her this that supplies would remain so scarce. For a long time after the surrender, one could wait weeks just for a particular piece of wood and a supply of nails. What work I could do under such circumstances had to be done to the main body of the house, which had by no means entirely escaped the damage, and progress on the garden corridor and the east wing has been slow. I have done what can be done. I have done what I can to prevent any serious deterioration. But here, we are still far from being able to open that part of the house again. Besides, now with only Noriko and myself left there seems less urgency to be extending our living space. Today, if I took you to the back of the house and moved aside the heavy screen to let you gaze down the remains of Sugimura's garden corridor, you may still gain an impression of how picturesque it once was. But no doubt, you will notice too the cobwebs and mold that I have not been able to keep out, and the large gaps of the ceilings, shielded away from the sky but only by sheets of tarpaulin. Sometimes, in the early morning, I have moved back to that screen to find the sunlight pouring through the tarpaulin in tinted shafts, revealing clouds of dust hanging on the air as though the ceiling had only that moment crashed down. Aside from the corridor and the east wing, the most serious damage was to the veranda. Members of my family, and particularly my 2 daughters, had always been fond of passing the time there, chatting and viewing the garden. And so, when Setsuko, my married daughter, first came to visit us after the surrender, I was not surprised to see how saddened he was by its condition. I had by then repaired the worst of the damage, but at one end it was still billowed and cracked where the impact of the blast had pushed up the boards from underneath. The veranda roof too had suffered, and on rainy days we were still having to line the floorboards and with receptacles to catch the water that came dripping through. Over this past year, however, I was able
to make a certain amount of progress, but by the time Setsuko came down to visit us again last month, the veranda was more or less entirely restored. Noriko had taken time off her work for her sister's visit, and so, the good weather continuing, my two daughters spent a lot of their time out there as of old. I often joined them, and at times it was almost it had been years ago when a sunny day the family would sit there together exchanging relaxed, often vacuous talk. At one point last month, it must have been the first morning after Setsuko's arrival, we were sitting there on the veranda after breakfast when Noriko said, I'm relieved that you have come at last, Setsuko. You'll take father's off my hands a little. Noriko, really? Her elder sister shifted uncomfortably on her cushion. Father takes a lot of looking after he's now retired, Noriko went on with a mischievous grin. You've got to keep him occupied or else he starts to mope. Really? Setsuko smiled nervously, then turned to the garden with a sigh. The maple tree seems to have recovered completely. It's looking splendid. Setsuko probably has no idea of what you are like these days, Father. She only remembers you from when you were a tyrant and ordered us all around. You're much more gentle these days, isn't that so? I gave a laugh to show Setsuko that this was all in good humor, but my elder daughter continued to look uncomfortable. Noriko turned back to her sister and added, but he does take a lot more looking after, moping around the house all day. She's talking nonsense as usual, I put in. If I spend the whole day moping, how did all this get repaired? Indeed, Setsuko said, turning to me and smiling. The house is looking marvelous now. Father must have worked very hard. Well, he had men in to help with all the difficult parts, Noriko said. You don't seem to believe me, Setsuko. Father's very different now. There's no need to be afraid of him anymore. He's much more gentle and domesticated. Noriko, really? He even cooked meals from time to time. You wouldn't have believed it, wouldn't you? But father's becoming but father's becoming a much better cook these days. Noriko, I think we have discussed this enough, Setsuko said quietly. Isn't that so, father? You've been making a lot of progress. I gave another smile and shook my head wearily. It was at that point, as I remember, that Noriko turned towards the garden and closing her eyes to the sunshine, said, Well, he can't rely on me to come back and cook when I'm married. I'll have enough to do without father to look after as well. As Noriko said this, her elder sister, whose gaze until then had been demurely turned away, suddenly gave me a swift, inquiring look. Her eyes left me again immediately, for she was obliged to return Noriko's smile. But a new, more profound uneasiness had entered Setsuko's manner, and she seemed grateful when her little boy, speeding past us down the veranda, gave her an opportunity to change the subject. Ichiro, please settle, she called after him. No doubt, after the modern apartment of his parents, Ichiro was fascinated by the large amount of space in our house. In any case, he seemed to not share our fondness of sitting on the veranda, preferring instead to run at great speed up and down its length, sometimes sliding along the polished boards. More than once, he had come close to upsetting our tea tray, but his mother's request that he sit down had so far been to little avail. This time too, when Setsuko called to him to take a cushion with us, she remained sulking at the end of the veranda. Come on, Ichiro, I called out. I'm tired of talking to women all the time. You come and sit beside me and we'll talk about men's things. This brought him straight away. He placed his cushion next to me, then seated himself in the most noble posture, hands on the hip, his shoulders flung well back. Oji-san, he said to me sternly, I have a question. Yes, Ichiro. What is it? I want to know about the monster. The monster? Is it prehistoric? Prehistoric? You know words like that already? You must be a clever boy. At this point, Ichiro's dignity seemed to give away. Abandoning his pose, he rolled onto his back and began waving his feet in the air. Ichiro! Setsuko called in an urgent whisper. Such bad manners in front of your grandfather! Sit up! Ichiro's only response was to allow his feet to slump lifelessly onto the floorboards. Then he folded his arms over his chest and closed his eyes. Oji-san, he said in a sleepy voice. Is the monster prehistoric? Which monster is this, Ichiro? Please excuse him, Setsuko said with a nervous smile. There was a film poster outside the railway station when we arrived yesterday. He inconvenienced the taxi driver with numerous questions. It's so unfortunate I didn't see the poster myself. Oji-san, is the monster prehistoric or isn't it? I want an answer. Ichiro! His mother gave him a horrified look. Well, I'm not sure, Ichiro. I should think we have to see the film to find out. When do we see the film then? You'd best discuss it with your mother. You never know, it may be too frightening for young children. I had not meant this remark to be provocative, but its effect on my grandson was startling. He rolled back into a sitting position and glared at me, shouting, How dare you! What are you saying? Ichiro! Setsuko exclaimed in dismay. But Ichiro continued to regard me with the most fearsome look, and his mother was obliged to leave her cushion to come over to us. Ichiro! She whispered to him, shaking his arm. Don't stare at your grandfather like that! Ichiro responded by falling onto his back again and waving his feet in the air. His mother gave me another nervous smile. So bad-mannered, she said. Then, seemingly at loss for another word, she smiled again. Ichiro-san, Noriko said, getting to her feet. Why don't you come and help me put away the breakfast things? Women's work, Ichiro said, his feet still waving. Oh, so Ichiro won't help me. Now that's the problem. The table's so heavy. I'm just not strong enough to put that away on my own. I wonder who could help then. This brought Ichiro abruptly to his feet and he went striding indoors without glancing at us. Noriko laughed and followed him in. Sachiko glanced after them and then, lifting the teapot, began refilling my cup. I had no idea things had come so far, she said, her voice lowered. I mean, as regards to Noriko's marriage negotiations. Well, things haven't come far at all, I said, shaking my head. In fact, nothing's settled at all. We are still at an early stage. Forgive me, but from what Noriko said just a moment ago, I naturally suppose things were more or less... She trailed off and then said, Forgive me. But she said it in such a way that the question was left hanging in the air. I'm afraid this isn't the first time Noriko's spoken like that, I said. In fact, she has been behaving oddly ever since this present negotiation began. Last week, we had a visit from Mr. Mori. You remember him? Of course. He's well? Well enough. He was just passing and called to pay his respect. This point is, Noriko began to talk about the marriage negotiations in front of him. She took much the same attitude as just now, that everything was settled. It was most embarrassing. Mr. Mori even congratulated me as he was leaving and asked me the groom's occupation. Oh, indeed, Satsuko said thoughtfully. It must have been embarrassing. But it was hardly Mr. Mori's fault. You hurt her yourself just now. What are strangers supposed to think? My daughter did not reply, and we sat there in silence for a few moments. Once I glanced over to her. Setsuko was gazing out in the garden, holding a teacup in both hands as though she had forgotten it was there. It was one of the several occasions during her visits last month when perhaps because of the way the candle. Sorry. One moment, please. Tea. Okay. It was one of the several occasions during her visit last month when, perhaps because of the way the light caught her or something, I found myself contemplating her appearance. For there can be no doubt Setsuko is becoming better looking as she gets older. In her youth, her mother and I had worried that she was too plain to make a good marriage. Holy shit, this sentence. It's okay. Even as a child, Setsuko had a rather masculine feature, which seemed only to grow even more pronounced with adolescence. So much so that whenever my daughter quarreled, Noriko was always able to get the better of her sister by calling her boy, boy. Who knows what effects such things have on personalities? It's no coincidence, surely, that Noriko should have grown up so headstrong and Satsuko so shy and retiring. But now, it seems, as she reaches her 30s, Setsuko looks are taking on a new and not inconsiderable dignity. I recall her mother predicting this. Our Setsuko will flower in the summer, she had often said. I had thought this merely my wife's way of consoling herself, but then several times last month I was struck by how correct she in fact had been. Well, the sentence is getting a bit hard. It's very good sentences, very good prose, but I'm not reading them well enough. Okay. Satsuko came out of her reverie and cast another glance inside the house. Then she said, I would suppose what happened last year greatly upset Noriko, much more perhaps than we supposed. I gave a sigh and nodded. It's possible I didn't pay enough attention to her at that time. Well, I'm sure father did all he could, but of course, such things are a terrible blow to a woman. I have to admit, I thought she was play acting a little the way your sister does sometimes. She had been insisting it was a love match. So when it fell through, she obliged to behave accordingly. But perhaps it wasn't all play acting. We laughed at the time, Satsuko said, but perhaps it was really a love match. We fell silent again. From inside the house, we could hear Ichiro's voice shouting something repeatedly. Forgive me, Satsuko said in a new voice. But did we ever hear any further as to why the proposal fell through last year? It was so unexpected. I have no idea. It hardly matters now, does it? Of course not. Forgive me. Satsuko seemed to consider something for a moment, then he spoke again. It's just that Suichi persists in asking me from time to time about last year, about why the Miyakes should have pulled out like that. She gave a little laugh almost to herself. He seemed convinced I know some secret that we are all keeping it from him. I have to continually reassure him that I have no idea myself. I assure you, I said a little coldly, it remains equally a mystery to me. If I knew, I wouldn't keep it from you and Suichi. Oh, of course. Please excuse me, I didn't mean to imply. Again, she trailed off awkwardly. I may have appeared a little short with my daughter that morning, but then, that was not the first time Satsuko had questioned me in such a way concerning last year and Miyake's withdrawal. Why she should believe I am keeping something from her, I do not know. If the Miyakes had some special reason for withdrawing like that, it would stand to reason. They would not confide in me about that. My own guess is that there was nothing so remarkable about the matter. True, Their withdrawal at the last moment was most unexpected, but why should one suppose from this that there was something peculiar in it? My feeling is that it was simply a matter of family status. The Miyake, from what I saw them, they were just a proud, honest sort who would feel uncomfortable at the thought of their son marrying above his station. Indeed, a few years ago they would probably have withdrawn more promptly, but what with the couple claiming it was a love match, and with all the talks these days about the new ways, the Miyakes are the kind of people who would become confused as to their correct purse. No doubt, the explanation is no more complicated than that. It is possible, too, that they were confused by my apparent approval of the match. For I was very lax in considering the matter of status, it simply not being my instinct to concern myself with such things. Indeed, I have never at any point in my life been very aware of my own social standing. And even now, I'm often surprised afresh when some event or something someone may say reminded me of the rather high esteem in which I am held. Just the other evening, for instance, I was down in our old pleasure district drinking at Mrs. Kawakami's place, where, as happens increasingly these days, Shintaro and I found ourselves the only customers. We were, as usual, sitting up at the bar on our high stools exchanging remarks with Mrs. Kawakami, and as the hours gone by and no one else had come in, our exchanges had grown more intimate. At one point, Mrs. Kawakami was talking about some relative of hers, complaining that the young man had been unable to find a job worthy of his abilities, when Shintaro suddenly exclaimed, "Well, you must send him to Sensei here, Oba-san. A good word from Sensei in the right place, your relatives will soon find a good post." "What are you saying, Shintaro?" I protested. "I'm retired now, and I have no connections these days." I was at first... a recommendation from a man of Sensei standing will command respect from anyone, Shintaro had persisted. "Send the young man to Sensei, Oba-san." I was at first... "Good morning, Ixia! Good morning!" I was a little taken aback from the conviction of Shintaro's assertions, but then I realized he was remembering yet again that the small deed I had performed for his younger brother all those years ago. "Good morning. We are, as the title is saying, we are reading Kazuo Ishiguro's An Artist of the Floating World. It's pretty good so far. I'm enjoying it. We are on page 20, so you are quite early. You didn't miss much, I think. It must have been 1935 or 1936, a very routine matter as I recall, a letter of recommendation to an acquaintance in the State Department, some such thing. I would have given the matter little further thought, but then one afternoon while I was relaxing at home, my wife announced there were visitors for me at this entryway. "Please show them in," I had said. "But they insist they won't bother you by coming in." I went out to the entryway. Standing there was Shintaro and his younger brother, then no more than a youth. As soon as they saw me, they began bowing and giggling. "Please step up," I said, but they continued simply to bow and giggle. "Shintaro, please step up on the tatami." "No, Sensei," Shintaro said, all the time smiling and bowing. "It is the height of impertinence for us to come to your house like this, the height of impertinence. We could not remain at home any longer without asking you. Come on inside." I believe Setsuko was just making some tea. "No, Sensei, it is the height of impertinence, really." Then turning to his brother, Shintaro whispered quickly, "Yosho, Yosho." For the first time, the young man stopped bowing and looked up at me nervously. Then he said, "I will be grateful to you for the remainder of my life. I will exert every particle of my being to be worthy of your recommendation. I assure you I will not let you down. I will work hard and strive to satisfy my superiors, and however much I may be promoted in the future, I will never forget the man who enabled me to start on my career." "Really, it was nothing. It's no more than you deserve." This brought frantic protests from both of them. Then Shintaro said to his brother, Yoshio, we have imposed enough on Sensei as it is, but before we leave, take a good look again at the man who has helped you. We are greatly privileged to have a benefactor of such an influence and generosity. Indeed, indeed, the youth muttered and gazed up at me. Please, Shintaro, this is embarrassing. Please come in and we'll celebrate with some sake. No, Sensei, we must leave you now. It was the greatest impertinence to come here like this and disturb your afternoon, but we could not delay thanking you for one moment longer. This visit, I must admit, left me with a certain feeling of achievement. It was one of those moments, in the midst of a busy career allowing little chance for stopping and taking stock, which illuminates suddenly just how far one has come. For true enough, I had almost unthinkingly started a young man on a good career. A few years earlier, such a thing would have been inconceivable, and yet I had brought myself to a position among without realizing it. Many things have changed since the old days, Shintaro, I pointed out to the other night down at Mrs. Kawakami's. I am retired now. I don't have so many connections. But then, for all I know, Shintaro may not be so wrong in his assumptions. It may be that if I choose to put it to the test, I would again be surprised by the extent of my influence. As I say, I had never had a keen awareness of my own standing. In any case, even if Shintaro may at times display naivety about certain things, this is nothing to be disparaged. This is nothing to be disparaged. It being no easy thing now to come across these days, someone so untainted by the cynicism and bitterness of our days. This is something reassuring about going to Mrs. Kawakami's and finding Shintaro sitting up there at the bar, just as one may have found him on any evening for the past 17 years or so. Absent-mindedly turning his cap round and round on the counter, in that old way of his. It is really as though nothing has changed for Shintaro. He will greet me very politely as though he was still my pupil, and throughout the evening, however drunk he may get, he will continue to address me as sensei and maintain his most respectful manner towards me. Sometimes he will even ask me questions relating to the technique or styles with all the eagerness of a young apprentice. Though the truth is, of course, Shintaro has long ceased to be concerned with any real art. For some years now, he has devoted his time to his book illustrations, and his present specialty, I gather, is fire engines. He will work day after day up in the attic room of his, sketching out fire engines after fire engines. But I suppose in the evening, after a few drinks, Shintaro likes to believe that he is still the idealistic young artist I first took under my supervision. This childlike aspect of Shintaro has frequently been a source of entertainment for Mrs. Kawakami, who has a somewhat wicked side to her. One night recently, for instance, during a rainstorm, Shintaro had come running into the bar and began squeezing his head out over the doormat. "Really, Shintaro?" Mrs. Kawakami had shouted at him. "What terrible manners!" At this, Shintaro had looked up in great distress, as though indeed he had committed an outrageous offense. He had then begun to apologize profusely, thus leading Mrs. Kawakami on further. "I've never seen such manners, Shintaro-san. You seem to have no respect for me at all." "Now stop this, Oba-san," I had appealed to her after a while. "That's enough. Tell him you're joking." "Joking? I'm hardly joking. This is the height of bad manners." And so it had gone on until Shintaro had become quite pitiful to watch. But then again, on other occasions, Shintaro will be convinced that he is being teased when he is in fact being spoken to quite earnestly. There was the time he had put Mrs. Kawakami in difficulties by declaring cheerfully of a general who had just executed as a war criminal. "I've always admired that man since I was a boy," I wonder what he's up to right now. Retired, no doubt. Some new customers had been present that night and had looked at him disapprovingly. Mrs. Kawakami, concerned for her trade, had gone to him and told him quietly of the general's fate, Shintaro had burst out laughing. Really, Oba-san, he said so loudly. Some of your jokes are quite extreme, Shintaro. Shintaro's ignorance of such matters is often remarkable, but as I say, it is not something to disparage. One should be thankful that there's still those uncontaminated by the current cynicism. In fact, it is probably in this very quality of Shintaro's this sense that he has remained somehow unscathed by things, which led me to enjoy his company more and more over these recent years. As for Mrs. Kawakami, although she will do her best not to allow the current mood to affect her, there is no denying she has been greatly aged by the war years. Before the war, she may still have passed for a young woman, but since then, something inside her seems to have broken and sagged. And when one remembers those she has lost in the war, it is hardly any wonders. Business, too, has become increasingly difficult for her. Certainly, it must have been hard for her to believe this is the same district where she opened her little place those 16 or 17 years ago. For nothing really remains of our old pleasure district now. Almost all of her old competitors have closed up and left, and Mrs. Kawakami must more than once have considered doing so likewise. But when her place is first ap- when her place first appeared, it was squeezed in the midst of so many other bars and eating houses. I remember some people doubting it could survive long. Indeed, you could hardly walk down those little streets without brushing against numerous cloth banners pressing at you from all sides, leaning out at you from their shop fronts, each declaring the attraction of their establishment in boisterous and lettering. But in those days, there was enough custom in the district to keep any number of such establishments thriving. On the warmer evenings particularly, the area would fill with people strolling unhurriedly from bar to bar or just standing talking in the middle of the street. Cars had long ceased to venture, and even a bicycle could be pushed with difficulty past those throngs of uncaring pedestrians. I say our pleasure district, but I suppose it was really nothing more than somewhere to drink, eat, and talk. You would have to go into the city center for the real pleasure quarters, the geisha houses and theaters. For myself, though, our own district was always preferable. It drew a lively but respectable crowd, many of them people like us, artists and writers lured by the promise of noisy conversations continuing throughout the night. The establishment of my own group frequently was called Migi Hidari and stood at a point where three side streets intersected to form a paved precinct. The Migi Hidari, unlike any of its neighbors, was a large sprawling space with an upper floor and plenty of hostesses in both Western and traditional dresses. I had played my own small part in the Migi Hidari coming to so dwarf its competitors, and in recognition of this, our group had been provided with a table in one corner for our sole use. Those who drank with me there were in fact the elite of my school: Kuroda, Murasaki, Tanaka, a brilliant young man already with growing reputations. They all of them relished conversations, and I remember many passionate arguments taking place around that table. Shintaro, I should say, was never one of that selected group. I would not myself have objected to his joining us, but there existed a strong sense of hierarchy amongst my pupils, and Shintaro was certainly not regarded as the first rank. In fact, I can recall one night, shortly after Shintaro and his brother had paid that visit to my house, my discussing that episode around our table. I remember the likes of Kuroda laughing at how grateful the brothers had been over a mere white collar appointment. But then they all listened solemnly as I recounted my views on how influence and status can creep up on someone who works busily, not pursuing these ends in themselves, but but for the satisfaction of performing tasks to his best of ability. At this point, one of them, no doubt it was Kuroda, leaned forward and said, I have suspected for some time that Sensei was unaware. Okay, one moment please. I forgot. Oh, Rico's cafe is open. I'll go to Rico's cafe after this. If she's still open. Okay. I have suspected for some time that Sensei was unaware of the high regard in which he is held by the people in this city. Indeed, as the instance he had just related amply illustrates, his reputation has now spread beyond the world of art to all walks of life. But how typical of Sensei Model's nature that he is unaware of this. How typical that he himself should be the most surprised when the esteem accorded to him. But to all of us here, it comes as no surprise. In fact, it may be said that respected enormously as he is by the public at large, it is we here at this table who alone know the extent to which that respect still falls short. But I personally have no doubt his reputation will become all the greater, and in years to come, our proudest honor will be to tell others that we were once the pupils of Masuji Ono. Now, there was nothing remarkable in all of this. It had become something of a habit that at one point in the evening, when we are all a little drunk, my protege would take to making speeches of loyal nature to me, and Kuroda in particular, being looked on as some sort of spokesman for them, gave a fair proportion of this. Of course, I usually ignore them, but on this particular occasion, as when Shintaro and his brother had stood bowing and giggling in my entryway, I experienced a warm glow of satisfaction. But then, it would not be accurate to suggest I only socialized with the best of my pupils. Indeed, the first time I ever stepped into Mrs. Kawakami's, I believe I did so because I wished to spend the evening talking something over with Shintaro. Today, when I recall that evening, I find my memory of it merging with the sound and images from all those other evenings. The lantern hangs up above doorways, and the laughter of people congregated outside of Migi Hidari, and the smell of deep fried food, a bar hostess persuading someone to return to his wife, and echoing from every direction, the clicking of numerous wooden sandals on the concrete. I remember it being a warm summer's night, and not finding Shintaro in his usual haunt. I wandered around those tiny bars for some time. For all competition, there must have been existed between those establishments. A neighborly spirit reigned, and it was quite natural that on asking after Shintaro at one such bar that night, I should be advised by the hostess without a trace of resentment to try for him at the new place. No doubt, Mrs. Kawakami could point out numerous changes, her little improvements that she has made over the years, but my impression is that her little place looked much the same the first night as it does today. On entering, one tends to be struck by the contrast between the bar counter lit up by warm, low-hung lights and the rest of the room which is in its shadow. Most of the customers prefer to sit up at the bar within the pool of light, and this gives a cozy, intimate feel to the place. I remember looking around me with approval that first night, and today, for all the changes which have transformed the world around it, Mrs. Kawakami's remains as pleasing as ever. But little else has remained unchanged. Coming out of Mrs. Kawakami's now, you could stand at her doorway and believe you have just been drinking at some outpost of civilization. All around, there's nothing but a desert of demolished rubble. Only the backs of several buildings. Ah! 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 This is a punishment for my shitty reading, I think.
Man, ooh, the prose is too good, bruh. I love this. This is going very well so far. I like it. I just need to read slower. I think. Not be so impatient. It's not that I want to finish it early, it's just that sometimes I read really fast.
Baka. Yep.
It's okay. It's okay. I don't know what happened, man. Uh, uh, uh. Don't move, don't move. Okay. I really don't know what happened. Okay. Don't know what happened. Don't know what happened. Whee. Okay. Sorry, Isabel. And anyone in my chat. I actually can't see how many people is in my chat, but I assume it's just one or two of you. Okay. Yeah, we shall continue. Okay, wait. Where did I start before I start fucking whining? So, now that the side of the street is nothing but rubble. Eh? Oh no, it's before that. But little else has remained unchanged. Coming out of Mrs. Kawakami's now, you could stand at her doorway and believe you have just been drinking at some outpost of civilization. All around, there is nothing but a desert of demolished rubble. Only the backs of several buildings far in the distance will remind you that you are not so far from the city center. War damage, as Mrs. Kawakami calls it. But I remember walking around the district shortly after the surrender, and many of those buildings were still standing. The Migi Hidari was still there, the windows all blown out, part of the roof fallen in. And I remember wondering to myself as I walked past those shattered buildings if they would ever again come back to life. Then, I came one morning and the bulldozers had pulled down everything. So now that the side of the street is nothing but rubble, no doubt the authorities have their plans, but it had been that way for 3 years. The rain collects in small puddles and grows stagnant amidst the broken brick. As a consequence, Mrs. Kawakami has been obliged to put up mosquito wiring on her windows, not an effect she thinks will attract customers. The buildings on Mrs. Kawakami's own side of the street have remained standing, but many are unoccupied. The properties on either side of her, for instance, have been vacant for some time, a situation which makes her uncomfortable. If she suddenly becomes rich, she often tells us she would buy up all those properties and expand. In the meantime, she waits for someone to move into them. She would not mind if they become bars just like hers, anything provided she no longer had to live in the midst of a graveyard. If you were to come out of Mrs. Kawakami's as the darkness was setting in, you might feel compelled to pause a moment and gaze at the waste expanse before you. You might still be able to make out through the gloom of those heaps of broken brick and timber, and perhaps here and there pieces of piping protruding from the grounds like weeds. Then, as you walk on those
More heaps of rubble. Numerous small puddles would gleam a moment as they caught in the lamplight. And if on reaching the foot of the hill which climbs up to my house, you pause at the bridge of hesitation and look back towards the remains of your old pleasure district, if the sun has not yet set completely, you may see the line of old telegraph poles still without wires to connect them, disappearing into the gloom down the route you have just come. And you may be able to make out the dark clusters of birds perched uncomfortably on the tops of the poles, as though waiting the wires along which they once lined the sky. One evening not so long ago, I was standing on that little wooden bridge and saw away in the distance two columns of smoke rising from the rubble. Perhaps it was government workers continuing some interminably slow program, or perhaps children indulging in some delinquent game. But the sight of those columns against the sky put me in a melancholy mood. They were like pyres at some abandoned funeral, a graveyard, Mrs. Kawakami says, and when one remembers all those people who had once frequented the area, one cannot help seeing it that way. But I am digressing. I was trying to recall here details of Setsuko's stay with us last month. As I have may said, Setsuko spent much of her first day of her visit sitting out on the veranda talking with her sister. At one point towards the latter part of the afternoon, when my daughters were particularly deep in women's talk, I recall I left them to go in search of my grandson, who a few minutes earlier had gone running into the house. It was as I was coming down the corridor that heavy thump made the whole house shake. Alarmed, I hurried into the dining room. At that time of the day, our dining room is a large shadow, and after the brightness of the veranda, it took my eyes a moment or two to ascertain that Ichiro was not in the room at all. Then came another thump, followed by several more, together with my grandson's voice shouting, "Yeah! Yeah!" The noise was coming from the adjoining piano room. I went to the doorway, listened for a moment, then quietly slid back into the partition. In contrast to the dining room, the piano room catches the sun throughout the day. It fills with a sharp, clear light, and had it been any larger, it would have been an ideal place in which we take our meals. At one time, I had used it to store paintings and materials, but nowadays, apart from the upright German piano, the room is practically bare. No doubt, this lack of clutter had inspired my grandson in much the same way as the veranda had earlier, for I found him progressing some across the floor with a curious stamping movement, which I took to be an impersonation of someone galloping on horseback across an open land. Because his back was turned to the doorway, it was some moments before he realized that he was being observed. "Oji-san," he said, turning angrily. "Can't you see I'm busy?" "I'm sorry, Ichiro. I didn't realize. I can't play with you just now." "I'm very sorry. But it sounded so exciting from out here. I wondered if I could come in and watch." For a moment, my grandson went on staring at me crossly. Then he said moodily, "All right, but you have to sit and be quiet. I'm busy." "Very well," I said with a laugh. "Thank you very much, Ichiro." Hello, Cicero. Good morning. We are at page 29. It's been a very good book so far. October 1948 of An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. My favorite, yet another of my favorite author. Very good writing here. Very, very good writing so far. My grandson continued to glare at me as I crossed the room and seated myself by the window. When Ichiro had arrived with his mother the previous evening, I had made him a gift of a sketch pad and a set of colored crayons. I now noticed a sketch pad lying down on the tatami nearby, 3 or 4 of the crayons scattered around it. I could see the first few leaves of the pad had been drawn on and was about to reach over to investigate when Ichiro suddenly recommenced the drama I had interrupted. Yeah, yeah! I watched him for a little, but could make little sense of the scene he was enacting. At intervals, he would repeat his harsh movement. At other times, he appeared to be in combat with numerous invisible enemies. All the while, he continued to mutter lines of dialogue under his breath. I tried to make this out, but as far as I could tell, he was not using actual words, simply making sounds with his tongue. Clearly, though he did his best to ignore me, my presence was having an inhibiting effect. Several times, he froze in mid-movement as though inspiration had suddenly deserted him before throwing himself into action again. Then, before long, he gave up and slumped on the floor. I wondered if I should applaud, but thought better of it. Very impressive, Ichiro. But tell me, who are you pretending to be? You guess, Oji-san. Lord Yoshitsune? Perhaps? No? A samurai warrior then? Or a ninja? Ninja of the wind. Oji-san's completely wrong scent. Completely on the wrong scent. Then tell me, who are you? Lone Ranger. What? Lone Ranger. Hi-yo, Silver. Lone Ranger? Is that a cowboy? Hi-yo, Silver. Ichiro began to gallop again and this time made a neighing noise. I watched my grandson for a moment. How did you learn to play cowboys, Ichiro? I eventually asked, and he just continued to gallop and neigh. Ichiro, I said more firmly, wait a moment and listen. It will be more interesting. It's more interesting by far to pretend to be someone like Lord Yoshitsune. Shall I tell you why? Ichiro, listen. Oji-san will explain to you. Ichiro, listen to Oji-san. Ichiro! Possibly, I raised my voice more than I had intended, for he stopped and looked at me with a startled expression. I continued to look at him for a moment and then gave a sigh. I'm sorry, Ichiro. I shouldn't have interrupted. Of course, you can be anyone you like, even a cowboy. You must forgive your Oji-san. He was forgetting a moment. My grandson continued to stare at me, and it occurred to me that he was about to burst into tears or else run out of the room. Please, Ichiro, you just carry on with what you were doing. For a moment longer, Ichiro went on staring at me. Then he suddenly yelled out, Lone Ranger! Hi-yo, Silver! And began to gallop again. He stamped more violently than ever, causing the whole room to shake around us. I went on watching him for a while, then reached over and picked up his sketchbook. Ichiro had used up the first 4 or 5 sheets somewhat wastefully. His technique was not at all bad, but the sketches of trams and trains had been each abandoned at a very early stage. Ichiro noticed me examining the sketch pad and came hurrying over. Oji-san! Who said you can look at those? He tried to snatch the pad away from me, but I held it out of his reach. Now, Ichiro, don't be unkind. Oji-san wants to see what you have been doing with the crayons he gave you. That's only fair. I lowered the sketch pad and opened it at the first drawing. Very impressive, Ichiro. But you know, it could be even better if you wanted. Oji-san, can't see those. My grandson made another attempt to snatch away the pad, obliging me to hold off his hands with my arms. Oji-san, give me back my book! Now, Ichiro, stop that. Let your Oji-san see. Look, Ichiro, bring me those crayons over there. Bring them over and we'll draw something together. Oji-san will show you. These words had a surprising effect. My grandson immediately stopped struggling, then went to gather up the crayons scattered on the floor. When he came back, something new, a kind of fascination, had entered his manner. He seated himself beside me and held out the crayons, watching carefully but saying nothing. I turned the sketch pad to a new sheet and placed it on the floor in front of him. Let me see you do something first, Ichiro. Then Oji will see if he can help to make it better at all. What do you want to draw? My grandson had become very quiet. He looked down at the blank sheet thoroughly and made no move to start drawing. Why don't you try and draw something you saw yesterday? I suggested. Something you saw when you first arrived in the city. Ichiro went on, looking at the sketchpad. Then he looked up and asked, was Oji a famous artist once? A famous artist? I gave a laugh. I suppose you might say that. Is that what your mother says? Father says you used to be a famous artist, but you had to finish. I've retired, Ichiro. Everyone retire when they get to a certain age. It's only right. They deserve a rest. Father says you had to finish because Japan lost the war. I gave another laugh and then reached forward and took the sketchpad. I turned back the leaves, looking through my grandson's sketches of trams, and held up one at arm's length for a better view. You reach a certain age, Ichiro, and you want a rest from things. Your father too will stop working when he gets to my age, and one day you will be at my age and you will want to rest too. Now, I returned to the blank sheet and placed the pad before him again. What will you draw for me, Ichiro? Did Oji do the picture in the dining room? No, that's by an artist called Urayama. Why? Do you like it? Did Oji paint the one in the corridor? That's the one by another fine artist, an old friend of Oji-san. Where are Oji-san's pictures then? They are tidied away for a moment. Now, Ichiro, let's get back to important things. What will you draw for me? What do you remember from yesterday? What's the matter, Ichiro? Suddenly so quiet. I want to see Oji-san's pictures. I'm sure a bright boy like you can remember all sorts of things. What about the film poster you saw? The one with the prehistoric monster. I'm sure someone like you could do it very well. Even better than the real poster, perhaps. Ichiro seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he rolled over to his front and his face close to the paper began to draw. Using a dark brown crayon, he drew on the lower part of the sheet a row of boxes, then which soon became a skyline of city buildings. And then there emerged, looming above the city, a huge lizard-like creature up on his hind legs. At this point, my grandson exchanged his brown crayon for a red one and began to make bright streaks around the lizard. What is this, Ichiro? Fire? Ichiro continued with his red streaks, not answering. Why is there fire, Ichiro? Is it to do with the monster appearing? Electric cables, Ichiro answered with an impatient sigh. Electric cables? Now that's interesting. I wonder why electric cables cause fire. Do you know? Ichiro gave another sigh and continued to draw. He picked up his dark crayon again and began to draw at the foot of the sheet, panic-stricken people fleeing in all directions. You are doing this very well, Ichiro, I remarked. Perhaps as a reward, Oji might take you see the movie tomorrow. Would you like that? My grandson paused and looked up. It might be too scary for Oji-san, he said. I doubt that, I said with a laugh. But it may well frighten your mother and your aunt. At this, Ichiro burst into laughter. He rolled over onto his back and laughed some more. Mother and Aunt Noriko will be really scared, he shouted at the ceiling. But we men will enjoy it, won't we? Won't we, Ichiro? We'll go tomorrow. Would you like that? We'll take the woman with us and watch them get frightened. Ichiro continued to laugh loudly. And Noriko will get scared straight away. She probably will, I said, laughing again myself. Very well. We all go tomorrow. Now, Ichiro, you'd better go on with your picture. Aunt Noriko will be scared. She'll want to leave. Now, Ichiro, let's carry on. You're doing very well. Ichiro rolled back and returned to his picture. His earlier concentration, though, seemed to have deserted him. He began to add more and more fleeing figures at the bottom of his sketch until the shapes merged and became meaningless. Eventually, abandoning any sense of care, he started to scribble wildly all over the lower section of the street. Ichiro, what are you doing? We won't go to the movie if you're going to do that. Ichiro, stop that. My grandson sprang to his feet and yelled out, Hayo, Silver! Ichiro, sit down. You haven't finished that. Where's Aunt Noriko? She's talking to your mother. Now, Ichiro, you haven't finished your picture yet, Ichiro. But my grandson went running out of the room, shouting, Lone Ranger! Hayo, Silver! I cannot recall precisely what I did with myself for the next several minutes. Quite possibly I remained sitting there in the piano room, gazing at Ichiro's drawing, thinking about nothing in particular, as I am increasingly prone to do these days. Eventually, though, I rose to my feet and went in search of my family. I found Setsuko sitting alone at the veranda, looking out at the garden. The sun was still bright, but the day had grown much cooler. And as I appeared, Setsuko turned and moved a cushion into a patch of sunlight for me. We made fresh tea, she said. Would you care for some, father? I thanked her, and as she poured for me, I cast my gaze out to the garden. For all it suffered during the war, our garden has recovered well, and is still recognizably the one Akira Sugimura built some 40 years ago. Down at the far end, near the back wall, I could see Noriko and Ichiro examining some bamboo bush. That bush, like almost all the other shrubs and trees in the garden, had been transplanted fully grown by Sugimura from elsewhere in the city. In fact, one rumor has it that Sugimura personally walked around the city, peering over garden fences, offering large sums of money to the owner of any shrubs or tree he wished to uproot for himself. If this is true, then he made his choice with admirable skill. The result was, and remains today, splendidly harmonious. There is a natural rambling feeling about the garden, with barely a hint of artificial design. Noriko was always so good with children, Setsuko remarked, her eyes on them. Ichiro's taken a great liking to her. Ichiro's a fine boy, I said. Not at all shy like a lot of children that age. I hope he wasn't giving you trouble just now. He can be quite headstrong at times. Please don't hesitate to scold him if he becomes a nuisance. Not at all. We are getting on fine. We are just practicing some drawing together, in fact. Really? I'm sure he enjoyed that. He was playing some scenarios for me too, I said. He mimes his action very well. Oh, yes. He occupies himself for long periods that way. Does he make up his own words? I was trying to listen, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. My daughter raised a hand to cover her laugh. He must be playing cowboys. When he plays cowboys, he tries to speak English. English? Extraordinary. So that's what it was. We took him once to the cinema to see an American cowboy film. He's been very fond of cowboys since then. We even had to buy him a 10-gallon hat. He's convinced cowboys make that funny sound what he does. It must have seemed very strange. So that's what it was, I said with a laugh. My grandson's become a cowboy. Down in the garden, a breeze was making the foliage sway. Noriko was crouching down by the old stone lantern near the back wall, pointing something out to Ichiro. Still, I said with a sigh, only a few years ago Ichiro wouldn't have been allowed to see such a thing as a cowboy film. Setsuko, without turning from the garden, said, Suichi believes that it's better he likes cowboys than he idolizes people like Miyamoto Musashi. Suichi thinks that the American heroes are better models for children now. Is that so? So that's Suichi's view. Ichiro seems unimpressed by the stone lantern, for we could see him tugging violently at his aunt's arm. Beside me, Setsuko gave an embarrassed laugh. He's so arrogant, pulling people back and forth. Such bad manners. Incidentally, I said, Ichiro and I decided to go to the cinema tomorrow. Really? I could see at once the uncertainty in Setsuko's manner. Yes, I said. He seemed very keen on this prehistoric monster. Don't worry, I'll look it up in the newspaper. The movie's perfectly suitable for a boy his age. Yes, I'm sure. In fact, I thought we should all go. A family outing, so to speak. Setsuko cleared her throat nervously. That would be most enjoyable. Perhaps, Noriko may also have some plans for tomorrow? Oh, what plans are those? I believe she was wanting us all to go to the deer park, but I'm sure that can be done another time. Oh, I had no idea Noriko had any plans. She certainly never asked me about them. Besides, I already told Ichiro we would go to the movie tomorrow. His heart will be set on it now. Indeed, said Setsuko. I'm sure he would like to go to the cinema. Noriko was coming up the garden path towards us and Ichiro leading her by her hand. No doubt I might have taken up with her straight away the matter of the following day, but she and Ichiro did not stay on the veranda, going inside to wash their hands. As it was evening, I was not able to raise the matter until supper that evening. Although during the day the dining room was rather dark and gloomy, placed on account of the sun rarely reaching it. After dark, with the light shade lower over the table, it has a cozy atmosphere. We had been sitting around the tables for several minutes, reading newspapers and magazines, when I said to my grandson, "Well, Ichiro, have you told your aunt about tomorrow?" Ichiro looked up from his book with a puzzled expression. "Shall we take the woman with us or not?" I said. "Remember we said they might find it too scary." This time my grandson understood me and grinned. "It might be too scary for Aunt Noriko," he said. "Do you want to come, Aunt Noriko?" "Come to what, Ichiro-san?" Noriko asked. "Monster film. I thought we'll all go tomorrow to the cinema," I explained. "A family outing, so to speak." "Tomorrow?" Noriko looked at me, then turned to my grandson. "Well, we can't go tomorrow, can we, Ichiro? We're going to the deer park, remember?" "The deer park can wait. The boy's looking forward to his film now." "Nonsense! Everything's arranged. We're going to call in on Mrs. Watanabe on the way back. She's been wanting to meet Ichiro. Anyway, we decided long time ago, didn't we, Ichiro?" "It's very kind of father," Setsuko put in, "but I understand Mrs. Watanabe is expecting us. Perhaps we should leave the cinema for until the day after." "But Ichiro has been looking forward to it," I protested. "Isn't that Ichiro? What a nuisance these women are." Ichiro did not look up at me, apparently absorbed again in his book. "You tell the woman, Ichiro," I said. My grandson continued to stare at his book. "Ichiro?" Suddenly, dropping his book, he got to his feet and went running out of the room, through into the piano room. I gave a small laugh. "There," I said to Noriko. "You have disappointed him now. You should have left things as they were." "Don't be ridiculous, father. We had arranged Mrs. Watanabe long ago. Besides, it's ridiculous to take Ichiro to see a film like that. He won't enjoy a film like that, will he, Setsuko?" My elder sister smiled uncomfortably. "It's very kind of father," she said quietly. "Perhaps the day after." I gave a sigh, shaking my head, returned to my newspaper, but after a few minutes, it became clear that neither my daughter was going to bring Ichiro back. I got myself up and went into the piano room. Ichiro, unable to reach to the cord of the light shade, had switched on the lamp on the top of the piano. I found him sitting on the piano stool, one side of his head resting on the piano lid. His features, squashed against dark wood, bore a disgruntled look. "I'm sorry about this, Ichiro," I said, "but don't be disappointed. We will go the day after." Ichiro gave no reaction, so I said, "Now, Ichiro, this is nothing to be disappointed about." I walked over to the window. It had become quite dark outside, and all I could see was my reflection and that of the room behind me. From the other room, I could hear the women talking in lowered voices. "Cheer up, Ichiro," I said. "This is nothing to get upset about. We'll go the day after, I promise you." When I turned again to Ichiro, his head was resting on the piano lid as before, but now he was walking his fingers along the lid as though playing the keys. I gave a light laugh. Well, Ichiro, we'll just go the day after. We can't have the woman ruling over us, can we? I gave another laugh. I expect they thought it would be too scary, eh, Ichiro? My grandson still gave no response, though he continued his finger movements on the piano lid. I decided it would be best to leave him alone for a few moments, and giving another laugh, went back through the dining room. I found myself sitting in silence reading their magazines. As I sat down, I gave a heavy sigh, but neither of them responded to this. I had replaced my reading glasses on my face and was about to start on my newspaper when Noriko said in a quiet voice, "Father, shall we make some tea?" "That's very kind of you, Noriko, but not for me just now." "What about you, Setsuko?" "Thank you, Noriko, but I don't think I will either." We continued to read in silence for a few more moments. Then Setsuko said, "Will father be coming with us tomorrow? We could still have our family outing then." "I would like to, but I'm afraid there are a few things I have to be getting on tomorrow." "What do you mean?" Noriko broke in. "What things are those?" Then turning to Setsuko, she said, "Don't listen to father. He's got nothing to do these days. He'll just mope about the house like he always does now." "It would be very pleasant if father would accompany us," Setsuko said to me. "It's regrettable," I said, looking down at my newspapers again, "but I have one or two more things to attend to." "So you're going to stay at home all on your own?" Noriko asked.
If you're going away, it seems I'll have to.
Setsuko gave a polite cough. Then she said, "Perhaps then I'll remain at home too. Father and I had little chance to exchange news." Noriko stared across the table at her sister. "There's no need for you to miss out. You've come out all this way. You don't want to spend your time indoors. Or spend all your time indoors. But I would very much enjoy staying and keeping father company. I expect we have a lot more news to exchange." "Father, look what you have done," Noriko said. Then to her sister, she said, "So it's just me and Ichiro now?" "Ichiro will enjoy spending the day with you, Noriko," Setsuko said with a smile. "You are very much his favorite at the moment." I was glad that Setsuko's decision to remain at home, for indeed we had little opportunity to talk about things without interruption, and there are, of course, many things a father wished to know about a married daughter's life which he cannot ask outright. But what never occurred to me that evening was that Setsuko would have her own reasons for wishing to remain in the house with me. It is perhaps a sign of my advancing years that I have taken to wandering into rooms for no purpose. When Setsuko slid open the door with the reception room that afternoon on the second day of her visit, I must have been standing there lost in thought for some considerable time. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'll come back later." I turned, a little startled, to find my daughter kneeling at the threshold, holding a vase filled with flowers and cuttings. "No, please come in," I said to her. "I was doing nothing in particular." "Retirement places more time on your hands. Indeed, it is one of the enjoyments of retirement that you are able to drift through the day at your own pace, easy in the knowledge that you have put hard work and achievement behind you. Nevertheless, I must be getting absent-minded, indeed, to be wandering aimlessly into all places, the reception room." For throughout my years I have preserved that sense instilled in my father that the reception room of the house is a place to be revered, a place to be kept unsoiled by everyday trivialities, reserved for the receiving of important guests, or else the paying respects at the Buddhist altar. Accordingly, the reception of my house has always had a more solemn atmosphere than that to be found in most households, and although I never made it a rule of it as my own father did, I discouraged my children when they were young from entering the room unless specifically bidden to do so. My God. Quick. Oh, sorry, just yawn.
Tea. My respect for reception rooms may well appear exaggerated, but then you must realize that
In the house I grew up in, Tsuruoka village, a half a day's train journey from here, I was forbidden even to enter the reception room until the age of 12. That room being in many senses the center of the house, curiosity compelled me to construct an image of its interior from the occasional glimpse I managed to catch of it. Later in my life, I was often to surprise colleagues with my ability to realize a scene on canvas based only on the briefest of passing glances. It is possible I have my father to thank for this skill and and in the advertent training he gave my artist's eye during those formative years. In any case, when I reached the age of 12, the business meetings began, and then I found myself inside the room once every week. Masuji and I will be discussing business tonight, my father would announce during supper, and that would serve both as my summons to present myself after the meal and as a warning to the rest of the family to make no noise in the vicinity of the reception room that evening. My father would disappear into the room after supper and would call me some 15 minutes later. The room I entered would be lit by a single tall candle standing in the center of the floor. Within the circle of light it cast, my father would be sitting cross-legged on the tatami before his wooden business box. He would gesture to me to sit opposite him in the light, and as I did so, the brightness of the candle would put the rest in the room into shadow. Only vaguely would I be able to discern past my father's shoulder the Buddhist altar by the far wall, or the few hanging adorning the alcoves. My father would then begin his talking. From out of his business box, he would produce small, fat notebooks, some of which he would open so that he could point out to me columns of densely packed figures. After a while, his talking would continue in a measured, grave tone, to pause only occasionally when he would look up at me as though for confirmation. At these points, I would hurriedly utter, "Yes, indeed." Of course, it was quite impossible for me to follow what my father was saying, employing jargons, recounting his way through lengthy calculations. He made no concessions to the fact that he was addressing a young boy, but it seemed equally impossible for me to ask him to stop and explain. For as I saw it, I had been allowed into the reception room only because I had been deemed old enough to understand such talk. My sense of shame was matched only by a terrible fear that at any moment I would be called upon to say more than "yes indeed" and my game would be up. And although month after month went by and I was never required to say anything more, I nevertheless lived in the dread of the next business meeting. Of course, it is clear to me now that my father never expected me for a moment to follow his talk, but I have never ascertained just why he put me through these ordeals. Perhaps he wished to impress upon me from that early age his expectation that I would eventually take over the family business, or perhaps he felt compelled that as future head of the family, it was only right I should be consulted on all decisions whose repercussions were likely to extend into my adulthood. That way, so my father may have figured it, I would have less cause for complaint were I to inherit an unsound business. Then, when I was 15, I remember being called into the reception room for a different kind of meeting. As ever, the room was lit by the tall candle. My father sat in the center of the light, but that evening, instead of his business box, he had before him a heavy earthenware ashpot. This puzzled me, for this ashpot, the largest in the house, was normally produced only for guests. "You have brought them all?" he asked. "I have done as you instructed." I laid beside my father the pile of paintings and sketches I had been holding in my arms. They made an untidy pile, sheets of varying sizes and quality, most of which had warped or wrinkled with paint. I sat in silence while my father looked through my work. He would regard each painting for a moment, then lay it two on one side. When he was almost halfway through my collection, he said without looking up, "Masuji, are you sure all your work here is done? Aren't there one or two paintings you haven't brought me?" I did not answer immediately. He looked up and asked, "Well?" "It is possible there may be one or two I have not brought." "Indeed, and no doubt, Masuji, the missing paintings are the very ones you are most proud of. Isn't that so?" He had turned his eyes down to the paintings again, so I did not answer. For several more moments I watched him going through the pile. Once he held one painting close to the candle flame, saying, "This is the path leading down the Nishiyama hill, is it not? You have caught the likeness very well. That's just how it looks coming down the hill. Very skillful." "Thank you. You know, Masuji," my father's eyes were still fixed on the painting, "I've heard very curious thing from your mother. She seems to be under the impression that you wish to take up painting as a profession." He did not phrase this as a question, so I did not at first reply. But then he looked up and repeated, "Your mother, Masuji, seems to be under the impression that you wish to take up painting as a profession. Naturally, she is mistaken supposing this." "Naturally," I said quietly. You mean there has been some misunderstanding on her part?" "No doubt." "I see." For a few moments my father continued to study the paintings, and I sat there watching him in silence. Then he said without looking up, "In fact, I think that was your mother going by outside. Did you hear her?" "I'm afraid I didn't hear anyone." "I think it was your mother. Ask her to step in here since she's passing." I rose to my feet and went to the doorway. The corridor was dark and empty, as I had known it would be. Behind me I heard my father's voice. "While you are fetching her, Masuji, gather together the rest of your paintings and bring them to me." Perhaps it was simply my imagination, but when I returned to the room a few minutes later, accompanied by my mother, I received the impression that the earthenware ash pot had been moved slightly nearer to the candle. I also thought there was a smell of burning in the air, but when I glanced into the ash pot, there were no signs of it having been used. My father acknowledged me distractedly when I placed the last example of my work beside the original pile. He appeared to be preoccupied with my paintings, and for some time he ignored both my mother and me, seated before him in silence. Then finally he gave a sigh, looked up, and said to me, "I don't expect, Masuji, you have much time for wandering priests, do you?" "Wandering priests? I suppose not." They have a lot of say about this world. I don't pay much attention to them most of the time, but it's only decent to be cautious to holy men, even if they strike you sometimes as nothing more than beggars." He paused, so I said, "Yes, indeed." Then my father turned to my mother and said, "Do you remember Sachiko, the wandering priest who used to come through this village? There was one who came to this house just after our son here was born, a thin, old man with only one hand, but a very sturdy fellow for all that. You remember him?" "Yes, of course," my mother said. "But perhaps one should not take heart to what some of these priests have to say." "But remember," my father said, "this priest gained a deep insight into Masuji's heart. He left us with a warning, you remember, Sachiko?" "But our son was no more than a baby then," my mother said, her voice lowered as though she somehow hoped I would not hear. In contrast, my father's voice was needlessly loud, as if addressing an audience. "He left us with a warning. Masuji's limbs were healthy, he told us, but he had been born with a flaw in his nature, a weak streak that would give him the tendency towards slothful and deceit. You remember this, Sachiko?" "But I believe the priest also had many positive things to say about our son." "This is true. Our son had a lot of good qualities. The priest did point this out. But you recall his warning, Sachiko. He said that if good points were to dominate, we who brought him up would have to be vigilant and check this weak streak whenever it tried to manifest itself. Otherwise, so the old priest told us, Masuji here would grow up to be a good for nothing. But perhaps, my mother said cautiously, it is unwise to take heart what these priests have to say. My father appeared a little surprised by this remark. Then, for a moment, he nodded thoughtfully, as though my mother had a perplexing point. I was reluctant to take him seriously at that time, he continued. But then, at every stage of Masuji's growing up, I have been obliged to acknowledge that old man's word. It can't be denied. There is a weakness running through our son's character. There's little in the way of malice in him, but unceasingly we have had to combat his laziness, his dislike of useful work, and his weak will. Then, with some deliberation, my father picked up 3 or 4 of my paintings and held up in both hands as though to test their weight. He turned his gaze towards me and said, Masuji, your mother here was under the impression that you wish to pursue painting as a profession. Has there perhaps been some misunderstanding on her part? I lowered my eyes and remained silent. Then I heard my mother's voice beside me, almost whispering, say, He's still very young. I'm sure it's just a childish whim of his. There was a pause. Then my father said, Tell me, Masuji, have you any idea what kind of world artists inhabit? I remained silent, looking at the floor before me. Artists, my father's voice continued, live in squalor and poverty. They inhabit a world which gives them every temptation to become weak-willed and depraved. Am I not right, Sachiko? Naturally. Yet, there are 1 or 2 who are able to pursue artistic career and yet avoid such pitfalls. Of course, there are exceptions, my father said. My eyes were still lowered, but I could tell from his voice that he was again nodding in his perplexed manner. The handful of extraordinary resolve and character, but I am afraid our son here is far from being such a person. Indeed, quite the contrary. It is our duty to protect him from such dangers. We do, after all, wish him to become someone we can be proud of, don't we? Of course, my mother said. I looked up quickly. The candle had burned halfway down its length, and the flame was sharply illuminating one side of my father's face. He had now placed the paintings on his laps, and I noticed how his fingers were moving impatiently along those edges. Masuji, he said, you may leave us right now. I wish to speak with your mother. I can remember a little later that night, coming across my mother in the darkness. In all likelihood, it was in one of the corridors that I encountered her, though I do not remember this. Neither do I remember why I was wandering around the house in the dark, but it was certainly not in order to eavesdrop on my parents, for I do recall being resolved to pay no heed to what occurred in the reception after my departure. In those days, of course, houses were all badly lit, so it was not unusual at all that we should stand in the dark and converse. I could make out my mother's figure in front of me, but could not see her face. There's a smell of burning around the house, I remarked. Burning? My mother was silent for a while. Then she said, No, I don't think so. It must be your imagination, Masuji. I smelled burning. I said, There, I just caught it again. Is father still in the reception room? Yes, he's working on something. Whatever he's doing in there, I said, it doesn't bother me in the least. My mother made no sound, so I added, the only thing father succeeded in kindling in my ambition. That is good to hear, Masuji. You must not misunderstand me, mother. I have no wish to find myself in years to come sitting where father is right now, telling my own son about accounts and money. Would you be proud of me if I grew up to be like that? I would be proud of you indeed, Masuji. There is much more to a life like your father's than you can possibly know at your age. I would never be proud of myself. When I said I was ambitious, I meant I wished to rise above such life. My mother fell silent for a moment. Then she said, when you are young, there are many things which appear dull and lifeless, but as you get older, you will find these very things, are the most important to you. I did not reply to this. Instead, I believe I said, once I was terrified of father's business meetings, but for some time now, they simply bored me. In fact, they disgust me. What are these meetings I'm so privileged to attend? The counting of loose change, the fingerings of coins hour after hour. I would never forgive myself if my life came to be like that. I paused and waited to see if my mother would say anything. For a moment, I had a peculiar feeling he had walked silently away while I was speaking, and I was now just standing there alone. But then I heard her move in front of me, so I repeated, it does not bother me in the least what father's doing in that reception room. All he has kindled is my ambition. However, I see I'm drifting. My intention had been to record here the conversation I had with Setsuko last month as she came into the reception room to change flowers. As I recalled it, Setsuko had seated herself before the Buddhist altar and had begun to remove the tired of the flowers decorating it. I had seated myself a little behind her, watching the way she carefully shook each stem before placing it on her lap, and I believe we were talking about something quite light-hearted at that stage. But then she said, without turning from her flowers, "Excuse me for mentioning this, father. No doubt it would have already occurred to you." "What is that, Setsuko?" "I merely mention it because I gather it is very likely Noriko's marriage negotiation will progress." Setsuko had begun to transfer one by one the fresh cuttings from out of her vase into those surrounding the altar. She was performing this task with great care, pausing after each flower to consider the effect. "I merely wish to say," she went on, "once the negotiations begin in earnest, it may be as well if father were to take certain precautionary steps." "Precautionary steps? Naturally. We will go carefully. But what precisely did you have in mind?" "Forgive me. I was referring particularly to the investigations." "Well, of course, will be as thorough as necessary. Well, we'll hire the same detective last year. He was very reliable, you may remember." Setsuko carefully repositioned a stem. "Forgive me, I am no doubt expressing myself unclearly. I was in fact referring to their investigation." "I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow you. I was not aware we had anything to hide." Setsuko gave a nervous laugh. "Father must forgive me. As you know, I never had a gift for conversation. Suichi is forever scolding me for expressing myself so badly. He expresses himself so eloquently. No doubt I should endeavor to learn from him." "I'm sure your conversation is fine, but I am afraid I don't quite follow what you're saying." Suddenly, Setsuko raised her hands in despair. "This breeze," she said with a sigh, reached forward to her flowers once more. "I like them like this, but the breeze doesn't seem to agree." For a moment, she became preoccupied again. Then she said, "You must forgive me, father. In my place, Suichi would express things better, but of course he isn't here. I merely wish to say that it is perhaps wise if father would take certain precautionary steps to ensure misunderstandings do not arise. After all, Noriko is almost 26 now. We cannot afford many more disappointments, such as last year's." "Misunderstanding about what, Setsuko?" "About the past. But please, I'm sure I'm speaking quite needlessly. Father has no doubt thought already of all these things and will do whatever is necessary." She sat back pondering her work, then turned to me with a smile. I have little skills in these things, she said, indicating the flowers. They look splendid. She gave a doubtful glance towards the altar and laughed self-consciously. Yesterday, as I was enjoying the tram ride down to the quiet suburb of Arakawa, the recollection of the exchange in the reception room came into my mind, causing me to experience a wave of irritation. As I looked out of the window at the scenery, growing ever less cluttered as we continued south, the image returned to my mind of my daughter seated in front of the altar, advising me to take precautionary steps. I remembered again the way she had turned her face towards me slightly to say, "After all, we cannot afford many more disappointments, such as last year's." And I remembered her knowing manner on the veranda the first morning of her visit, when she had hinted I had some peculiar secret about the Miyake's withdrawal last year. Such recollections had already marred my mood over this past month, but it was yesterday, in the tranquillity of travelling alone to the quieter reaches of the city, that I was able to reconsider my feelings more clearly, and I came to realize my sense of irritation was not essentially directed against Setsuko, but against her husband. It is, I suppose, natural enough that a wife is influenced by her husband's ideas, as in the case of Suichi, when they are quite irrational. But when a man induces his wife to turn suspicious thoughts against her own father, then that is surely cause enough for resentment. On account of what he must have suffered out in Manchuria, I have in the past tried to adopt tolerant attitude towards certain aspects of his behavior. I have not taken personally, for instance, the frequent signs of bitterness he has displayed toward my generation. But then, I always assume such feelings fade with time. However, so far as Suichi is concerned, they seem to be growing more trenchant and unreasonable. All this would not be bothering me now. After all, Setsuko and Suichi live far away, and I never see them more than once a year. If it were not that latterly, ever since Setsuko's visit last month, this irrational idea seems to be infecting Noriko's mind. This is what has tempted me several times these past few days to write an angry letter to Setsuko. It is very well a husband and wife occupying each other with ridiculous speculation, but they should keep such things to themselves. A stricter father, no doubt, would have done something long ago. More than once last month, I had come upon my daughters deep in discussion and noticed how they broke off guiltily before starting some fresh, rather unconvincing conversation. In fact, I can recall this happening at least 3 times during the course of 5 days Setsuko spent here. And then, just a few days ago, Noriko and I were finishing breakfast when she said to me, "I was walking past the Shimizu department store yesterday, and guess who I saw standing at the tram stop? It was Jiro Miyake." "Miyake?" I looked up from my bowl, surprised to hear Noriko mentioning the name so brazenly. "Why, that was so unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" "Well, father, I was rather pleased to see him." He seemed embarrassed though, so I didn't talk to him for long. In any case, I had to get back to the office. I was just out on an errand, you see. But did you know he's engaged to be married now?" "He told you that? What a nerve!" "He didn't volunteer it, of course. I asked him. I told him I was in the middle of a new negotiation right now, and asked him how his own marriage prospects were. I asked him just like that. His face was going scarlet. But then he came out with it and said that he was all but engaged now. It's all practically settled." "Really, Noriko, you shouldn't be so indiscreet. Why did you have to mention marriage at all?" "I was curious. I'm not upset about it anymore. And with the present negotiation going so well, I was just thinking the other day what a pity would it be if Jiro Miyake was still brooding over last year. So you can imagine how pleased I was to find him practically engaged." "I see. I hope I get to see his bride soon." I'm sure she's very nice, aren't you, father? I'm sure. We continued eating for a moment, then Noriko said, there was something else I almost asked him, but I didn't. She leaned forward and whispered, I almost asked about last year, about why they pulled out. It was just well, you did. It's just as well you didn't. Besides, they gave their reason clearly enough at the time. They felt that the young man was inadequate placed to be worthy of you. But you know that was just formality, father. We never know. We never found out the real reason. At least I never got to hear about it. It was at this point that something in her voice made me look up again from my bowl. Noriko was holding her chopsticks poised in the air as though waiting for me to say something, and then, as I continued eating, she said, why do you suppose they pulled out? Did you ever discover that? I discovered nothing. As I say, they said that they felt that the young man was inadequately placed. It's a perfectly good answer. I wonder, father, if it was simply that I didn't come up to their requirement. Perhaps I wasn't pretty enough. Do you think that was what it was? It wasn't anything to do with you, you know that. There are all sorts of reasons why a family pulls out of a negotiation. Well, father, if it wasn't to do with me, then I wonder what it could have been to make them pull out like that. It seemed to me there was something unnaturally deliberate in the way my daughter uttered those words. Perhaps I imagined it, but then a father comes to notice any small inflections in her daughter's speech. In any case, that exchange with Noriko put me in mind again on the occasion I myself had encountered Jiro Miyake and had ended up talking with him at a tram stop. It was just about a year ago. The negotiation with the Miyake family was still going on at that point, towards the late afternoon when the city was full of people returning home for the day's work. For some reason, I had been walking through the Yokote district and was making towards the tram stop outside the Kimura Company building. If you are familiar with the Yokote district, you will know of the numerous small, rather seedy offices that line the upper stories of the stores there. When I encountered Jiro that day, he was emerging from one such office, having come down a narrow staircase between the two shops' fronts. I had met him twice prior that day, but only at formal family meetings when he had turned out in his best clothes. Now he looked quite different, dressed in a tired-looking raincoat a little too large for him, clutching a briefcase under his arms. He had the appearance of a young man much accustomed to be bossed around. Indeed, his whole posture seemed to be fixed on the verge of bowing. When I asked him if the office he had just left was his workplace, he began laughing nervously as though I had caught him coming out of some disreputable house. It did occur to me his awkwardness was perhaps too extreme to be accounted for merely by our chance meeting, but at the time I put it down to his embarrassment at the shabby appearance of his office building and its surroundings. It was only a week or so afterwards, when learning with surprise that the Miyakes had pulled out, that I found myself casting my mind back to that encounter, searching it for significance. I wonder, I said to Setsuko, for she was down on one of her visits at the time, if all that while I was talking with him, they had already decided on the withdrawal. That would certainly account for the nervousness father observed, Setsuko had said. Did he not say anything to hint at their intentions? But even then, only a week after the actual encounter, I could hardly recall the conversation I had had with the young Miyake. That afternoon, of course, I was still going on the assumption that his engagement to Noriko would be announced any day, and that I was dealing with a future member of my family. My attentions then were focused on getting young Miyake to relax in my presence, and I did not give as much thought as I might to what was actually said during our short walk to the tram stop and the few minutes we spent standing there together. Nevertheless, as I pondered over the whole business during the days which followed, a new idea struck me, that perhaps the encounter itself had helped bring about the withdrawal. It's just possible, I put it to Setsuko. Miyake was very self-conscious about my having seen his workplace. Possibly it struck him afresh that there was too much of a gulf between our families. After all, it's a point they have made too often for it just to be formality. But Setsuko, it would seem, was unconvinced by that theory. It seems she must have gone home to her husband to speculate over the failure of her sister's proposal. For this year, she appears to have returned with her own theories, or at least those of Suichi's. So then I am obliged to think back yet again to that encounter with Miyake, to turn it over from yet another perspective. But as I have said, I could barely recall what had taken place just 1 week afterwards, and now, more than a year has passed. But then, one particular exchange had come back to me which I gave little significance to before. Miyake and I reached the main street and were standing in front of the Kimura Company building, awaiting our respective trams. And I remembered Miyake saying, "We have some sad news at work today. The president of our parent company is now deceased." "I'm very sorry to hear that. Was he advanced in years?" "He was only in his early 60s. I never had a chance to meet him in the flesh, though of course I saw photographs of him in our periodicals. He was a great man, and we all feel as though we have been orphaned." "It must be a blow to you all." "Indeed it is," Miyake said and paused for a moment. Then he continued, "However, we at our office are at something of a loss as to the most appropriate way of showing our respect. You see, to be quite frank, the president committed suicide." "Really?" "Indeed. He was found gassed, but it seemed he tried harakiri at first, but there were minor scratches around his stomach." Miyake looked down at the ground solemnly. "It was his apology on behalf to the companies under his charges." "His apology?" "Our president clearly felt responsible for certain undertakings we are involved during the war. 2 senior men were already dismissed by the Americans, but our president obviously felt it was not enough. His act of apology on behalf of us all to the families of those killed in the war." "Why, really?" I said. "That seems rather extreme. The world seems to have gone mad. Every day there seems to be report of someone else killing himself in apology. Tell me, Mr. Miyake, don't you find it all a great waste? After all, if your country is at war, you do all you can do in support. There's no shame in that. What need is there to be apologized by death?" "No doubt you are right, sir. But to be frank, there's much relief around the company. We feel now we can forget the past transgression and look into the future. It was a great thing our president did, but a great waste too. Some of our best men are giving up their lives this way." "Indeed, sir, it is a pity. Sometimes I think there are many who should be giving up their lives in apology who are too cowardly to face up to their responsibilities. It is then left to the likes of our president to carry out the noble gestures. There are plenty of men already back in positions they held during the war. Some of them are no better than war criminals. They should be the one apologizing." "I see your point," I said, "but those who fought and worked loyally for our country during the war cannot be called war criminals. I felt that's an expression used too freely these days." "But these are the men who led the country astray, sir. Surely it's only right they should acknowledge their responsibility. It's a cowardice that these men refuse to admit to their mistakes. And when those mistakes were made on behalf of the whole country, why then it must be the greatest cowardice of all." Did Miyake really say all this to me that afternoon? Perhaps I am getting his words confused with the sort of Suichi will come out and say. This is quite possible. I had, after all, come to regard Miyake as a prospective son-in-law, and I may have indeed somehow associated him with my actual son-in-law. Certainly, phrases like the greatest cowardice of the all sounded more like Suichi than the mild-mannered young Miyake. I am certain, though, that some such conversation did take place at the tram stop that day, and I suppose it is somewhat curious he should have brought up such a topic as he did. For such a phrase, the greatest cowardice of all, I am sure that is Suichi's. In fact, now that I think of it, I am sure Suichi used it on the evening after the ceremony for the burying of Kenji's ashes. It had taken more than a year for my son's ashes to arrive from Manchuria. The communists, we were constantly told, had made everything difficult there. Then, when his ashes finally came along, with those of 23 other young men who had died attempting that hopeless charge across the minefield, there were no assurance ashes were in fact Kenji's and Kenji's alone. But if my brother's ashes are mingled, Setsuko had written to me at that time, they would be only mingled with those of his comrades. We cannot complain about that. And so we accepted the ashes of Kenji's and carried out a belated ceremony for him 2 years ago last month. It was in the midst of the ceremony at the cemetery that I saw Suichi striding away angrily. When I asked Setsuko what's the matter with her husband, she whispered quickly, "Please forgive him. He isn't well. A touch of malnutrition. He hasn't shaken it off for months." But later, as the guests from the ceremony were gathering in my house, Setsuko said to me, "Please understand, father. Such ceremonies upset Suichi deeply." "How touching," I said. "I had no idea he was so close to your brother." "They got on well whenever they meet," Setsuko said. "Besides, Suichi identifies very much with the likes of Kenji. He says it could so easily have been him." "But isn't that all the more reason not to desert the ceremony?" "I'm sorry, father. Suichi never intended to appear disrespectful, but we have attended so many ceremonies this past year for Suichi's friends and comrades, and they always make him angry." "Angry? What is it he's angry about?"
One thing. Bum 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 bum. There you go. Continue reading.
But more guests were arriving at the point, and I was obliged to break off our conversation. It was not until later that evening I got a chance to talk to Suichi himself. Many of the guests were still with us, gathered in the reception room. I spotted my son-in-law's tall figure across the room, standing alone. He had parted the screens which opened onto the garden, and with his back turned to the hum of conversation, was gazing out into the darkness. I went up to him and said, "Setsuko tells me, Suichi, these ceremonies make you angry." He turned and smiled. "I suppose they do. I get angry thinking about things, about the waste. Yes, it's terrible to think of the waste. But Kenji, like many others, died very bravely." For a moment, my son-in-law gazed at me with a still, expressionless face. It is something he does from time to time which I have never quite got used to. The gaze, no doubt, is quite innocent, but perhaps Suichi is a physically powerful man, and his features rather fearsome. It is easy to read something threatening or accusing there. "There seems to be no end to courageous death," he said eventually. "Half of my high school graduation year have died a courageous death. Were they all for stupid causes, though they will never to know that. Do you know, father, what really makes me angry?" "What is that, Suichi?" "Those who sent the likes of Kenji out there to die these brave deaths. Where are they today? They're carrying on with their lives, much the same ever. Many more successful than before, behaving so well in front of the Americans, and the very ones who led us to the disaster. And yet, it's the likes of Kenji we have to mourn. That is what makes me angry. Brave young men died for stupid causes, and the real culprits are still with us, afraid to show themselves for what they are, to admit their responsibility. And it was then, I'm sure, as he turned back to the darkness outside, that he said, "To my mind, that's the greatest cowardice of all." I had been drained by the ceremony. Otherwise, I might have challenged some of his assumptions. But I judged there would be other opportunities for such talks, and moved the conversation to other matters. I recall standing there with him, looking out into the night, inquiring about his work and about Ichiro. At that point, I had hardly seen Suichi since his return from the war, and that was my first experience of the change, somewhat bitter son-in-law I have now come to get used to. I was surprised that evening to find him talking that way, with no trace of the rigid manner he had had before going to the war. But I put it down the emotional effect of the burial ceremony, and more generally, the enormous impact of his war experience, which, so Setsuko had hinted, had been of a terrible nature. But in fact, the mood I found him in the evening proved to be the typical of his general mood these days. The transformation from the polite, self-effacing young man who married Setsuko 2 years before the war is quite remarkable. Of course, it is tragic that so many of his generation died as they did, but why must he harbor such bitterness for his elders? There is a hardness, almost a maliciousness to Suichi's views now, which I find worrying, even more so since they appear to be influencing Setsuko. But such a transformation is by no means unique to my son-in-law. These days I see it all around me. Something has changed in the character of the younger generation, in a way I do not fully understand, and certain aspects of this change are undeniably disturbing. For instance, just the other night down at Mrs. Kawakami's, I overheard a man sitting further along the counter saying, "I hear they took that idiot to the hospital. A few broken ribs and a concussion." "You mean the Hirayama boy?" Mrs. Kawakami asked with a look of concern. "Is that his name?" "The ones who's always wandering around shouting things out. Someone really ought to get him to stop. It seems he got beaten up again last night. It's a shame, taking on an idiot like that, whatever he's shouting." At that point, I turned to the man and said, "Excuse me, you said the Hirayama's boy has been attacked. For what reason?" "It seems that he kept singing one of those old military songs and chanting regressive slogans." "But the Hirayama boy's always done that," I pointed out. "He's only been able to sing 2 or 3 songs. It's what he was taught." The man shrugged. "I agree. But what's the sense in beating up an idiot like that? It's just carelessness. He is over by the Kabayashi bridge, and you know how sleazy things get there after dark. He had been sitting up on the bridge post singing and chanting for about an hour. They could hear him in the bar across that way, and it seemed a few of them got tired of it." "What sense is there in that?" Mrs. Kawakami said. "The Hirayama boy means no harm." "Well, someone should teach him how to sing new songs," the man said, drinking from his glass. "He'll only get beaten up again if he goes around singing those old ones." "We still call him the Hirayama boy, though he must now be at least 50. But then, the name does not seem inappropriate, for he has the mental age of a child. For as far as I can remember, he has been looked after by the Catholic nuns at the mission. But presumably he was born to a family called Hirayama. In the old days, when our pleasure district was flourishing, the Hirayama boy could always be found sitting in its neighboring establishments. He was, as Mrs. Kawakami said, quite harmless, and indeed, in the years before and during the war, he became a popular figure in the pleasure district, with his war songs and mimicking of those patriotic speeches." One moment, please. Who taught him those songs? I do not know. There were no more than 2 or 3 in his repertoire, and he knew only a verse of each. But he would deliver these in a voice of a considerable carrying power, and between the singing, he would amuse spectators by standing there grinning at the sky, his hands on his hips, shouting, "This village must provide its share of sacrifices for the emperor. Some of you will lay down your lives.
Some of you will return triumphant to a new dawn, or some such words. And people would say, the Hirayama boy may not have it all there, but he's got the right attitude. He's Japanese. I often saw people stop to give him money or else buy him something to eat. And on those occasions, the idiot's face would light up in a smile. No doubt, the Hirayama boy would became fixated on those patriotic songs because of the attention and popularity they earned him. Nobody minded idiots in those days. What has come over people that they feel inclined to beat this man up? They may not like his songs and speeches, but in all likelihood they are the same people who once patted his head and encouraged him until those few snatches embedded themselves in his brain. But as I say, there's a different mood in the country these days, and Suichi's attitude are probably by no means exceptional. Perhaps I'm being unfair if I credit young Miyake too with such bitterness, but then the way things are at present, if you examine anything anyone says to you, it seems you will find a thread of this same bitter feeling running through it. For all I know, Miyake did speak those words. Perhaps all men of Miyake's and Suichi's generation have come to think and speak like that. I believe I have already mentioned that yesterday I took a trip down to the south of the city to the Arakawa district. The Arakawa is the last stop of the city tram line going south, and many people expressed surprise that the line should extend so far down into the suburbs. Indeed, it is hard to think of Arakawa with its certainly swept residential street, its rows of maple trees on the pavements, its dignified houses, each set apart from the next, and its general air of being surrounded by countryside, as being part of the city. But to my mind, the authorities were correct to take tram lines as far as Arakawa. It can only benefit city dwellers that they have easy access to a calmer, less crowded surroundings. We were not always very so well served, and so I recall how the hemmed-in feeling one gets in the city, especially during the hot summer weeks, which significantly greater in those days before the present tram lines were laid down. I believe it was 1931 when the present line began to operate, superseding the inadequate lines which had so irritated passengers for the previous 30 years. If you were not living here then, it is perhaps hard to imagine the impact these new lines had on many aspects of life in the city. Whole districts seemed to change character overnight. Parks that had always been busy with people become deserted. Long established businesses suffered severe losses. There they were, of course, those districts which found themselves unexpectedly benefited, and among these was the area of the other side of the Bridge of Hesitation, soon become our pleasure district. Prior to the new tram lines, you would have found only a few dull back streets with rows of shingled roof houses. No one at the time considered it a district on its own right, and one could only locate it by saying the east of Furukawa. The new tram line circuit, however, meant that passengers disembarking the terminus in Furukawa could reach the city center more quickly on foot than by making a second, highly circuitous tram journey, and the result was a sudden influx of people walking through the area. The handful of bars that were there already began after years of mediocre trade to flourish dramatically, while new ones opened one after the other. The establishment that was to become the Migi Hidari was known at the time simply as Yamagata's, after its proprietor, an old veteran soldier, and was the longest established bar in the district. It was somewhat colorless place in those days, but I had used it regularly over the years since it first coming into the city. As far as I can recall, it was not until a few months after the arrival of the new tram lines that Yamagata saw that
saw what was happening around him and began to formulate his ideas. With the area set to become fully fledged drinking quarter, his own establishment being the oldest and situated as it was in the intersection of three streets, stood naturally to become a sort of patriarch among local establishments. In view of this, so he saw it, it was his responsibility to expand and reopen in grand style. The tradesman above him was ready to be bought out, and the necessary capital could be raised without difficulty. The main stumbling block, both as regards to his own establishment and the district as a whole, was the attitude of the city authorities. In this, Yamagata was undoubtedly correct, for this was 1933 or 1934, an unlikely time, you may recall, to be contemplating the birth of a new pleasure district. The authorities had been playing arduous policies to keep more frivolous side of the city life in check, and indeed, in the city center, many of the decadent establishments were in the process of being closed down. At first, then, I did not listen to Yamagata's idea with such sympathy. It was only when he told me just what sort of place he had in mind that I became sufficiently impressed and promised I would do what I could to help him. I believe I have already mentioned the fact that I played a small part in the Migi Hidari's coming into existence. Of course, not being a man of wealth, there was little I could do financially, but by that time, my reputation in the city had grown to a certain extent, as I recall, as I was not yet serving on the Arts Committee of the State Department, but I had many personal links there and was already being consulted frequently on matters of policy. So then, oh, you gotta go? No. Sorry, I haven't finished. There's still pages to go. I don't want to stop now. I cannot stop now. I cannot stop until this is finished. Okay, wait. So then, my petition to the authorities on Yamagata's behalf was not without weight. It is the owner's intention, I explained, that the proposed establishment to be a celebration of the new patriotic spirit emerging in Japan today. The decor would reflect the new spirit, and any oh my god, I just went Patreon. Any patron, sorry, incompatible with the spirit would be firmly encouraged to leave. Furthermore, it is the owner's intention that the establishment be a place where the city's artists and writers whose works most reflect the new spirit can gather and drink together. With respect to this last point, I have myself secured the support of various of my colleagues, amongst them painter Masayuki Harada, the playwright Misumi, the journalist Shigeo Otsuji and Eiji Natsuki, all of them, as you know, producers of work unflinchingly loyal to the imperial majesty of to His Imperial Majesty the Emperor. I need tea. I need tea, and I need tea. Okay. I went on to point out such establishment, given its dominance in the neighborhood, would be an ideal means by which to ensure that a desirable tone prevailed in the district. Otherwise, I warned, I fear we are faced with such growth of another quarter characterized by the very sort of decadence we have been doing our best to combat, and which we know so weakens the fiber of our culture. The authorities responded not simply with acquiescence, but with an enthusiasm that surprised me. It was, I suppose, another of those instances when one is struck by the realization that one is held in rather higher esteem than one supposed. But then, I was never one to concern myself with matters of esteem, and this was not why the advent of Migi Hidari brought me so much personal satisfaction. Rather, I was proud to see born out of something I had maintained for some time, namely that the new spirit of Japan was not incompatible with enjoying oneself. That is to say, there was no reason why pleasure seeking had to go hand in hand with decadence. So, then, some 2.5 years after coming of the new tramlines, the Migi Hidari was open. The renovation had been skillful and extensive, so that anyone strolling that way after dark could hardly fail to notice the brightly lit front way after dark with its numerous lanterns, large and small, hung along the gables, under the eaves, and neat rows of the windows ledges, and above the main entryway too. There was that enormous illuminated banner suspended from the ridge pole bearing the new name of premises against the background of army boots marching in formation. One evening, shortly after its opening, Yamagata took me aside, told me to choose my favorite table, declared that thereafter it was reserved for my sole purpose use. Primarily, I suppose this was in recognition of the small service that I had done for him, but then, of course, I had always been one of Yamagata's best customers. Indeed, I had been going to Yamagata's for over 20 years prior to its formation into the Migi Hidari. This was not really this was not really through any deliberate choice of my part, as I say. It was an undistinguished sort of place. But when I first came to this city as a young man, I was living in Furukawa and Yamagata's place happened to be at hand. It is perhaps hard for you to picture how ugly Furukawa was in those days. Indeed, if you are new to the city, my talking of Furukawa district probably conjures up the park that stands there today and the peach trees for which it is renowned. But when I first came to the city in 1913, the area was full of factories and warehouses belonging to the smaller companies, many of them abandoned or in disrepair. The houses were old and shabby, and the only people who lived in Furukawa were those who could afford only the lowest rents. Mine was a small attic room above an old woman living with her unmarried son, and was quite unsuitable for my needs. There being no electricity in the house, I was obliged to paint by oil light. There was barely enough space to set up an easel, and I could not avoid splashing the wall and tatami with paint. I would often wake the old woman or her son while working throughout night, and most vexing of all, the attic ceiling was too low to allow me to stand up fully. I would often work for hours in a half crouch position, hitting my head continually on the rafters. But then, in those days, I was so delighted at having been accepted by the Takeda firm, and to be earning my living as an artist, that I gave little thoughts to this unhappy living condition. During the day, of course, I did not work in my room, but at Master Takeda's studio. This too was in Furukawa, a long room above a restaurant, long enough in fact for all 15 of us to set up easels in a row. The ceiling, though higher than that in my attic room, sagged considerably at the center, so that whenever we entered the room we always joked that it had descended a few more centimeters since the previous day. There were windows along the length of the room, and these should have given us a good light to work by, but somehow the shafts of the sunlight that came in were always too sharp, giving the room something of the look of a ship cabin. The other problem with the place was the fact that the restaurateur downstairs would not allow us to remain after 6 o'clock in the evening, when his customers would begin to come in. "You sound like a herd of cattle up there," he would say. We would thus have no choice but to continue our work back at our respective lodgings. I should perhaps explain that there was no chance of our completing our schedule without working in the evenings. The Takeda firm prided itself on its ability to provide high number of paintings in a very short time, in a very short notice. Indeed, Master Takeda gave us to understand that if we failed to fulfill our deadline in the time for the ship leaving harbor, we would quickly lose future commissions to rival firms. The result was that we will work the most arduous hours late into the night and still feel guilty the next day because we were behind schedule. Often, as the deadline approached, it would not be unusual for us to be living on just 1 or 2 hours of sleep each night and painting around the clock. At times, if several commissions came in one after the next, we would be going from day to day dizzy with exhaustion. But for all that, I cannot recall our ever failing to complete a mission on time, and I suppose that gives some indication of the hold Master Takeda had over us. After I had been with Master Takeda a year or so, a new artist joined the firm. This was Yasunari Nakahara, a name I doubt will mean much to you. In fact, there is no reason why you should have come across it, since he never achieved any kind of reputation. The most he did was eventually to gain a post as an art teacher in a high school in the Yuyama district a few years before the war, a post, I am told, he still holds today. The authorities seeing no reason to replace him as they did so many of his fellow teachers. Myself, I always remember him as the tortoise, the name given to him during those days at the Takeda firm, and one of which I came to use affectionately throughout our friendship. I still have in possession a painting by the tortoise, a self-portrait he painted not long after the Takeda days. It shows a thin young man with spectacles sitting in his shirt sleeve in a cramped, shadowy room, surrounded by easels and rickety furniture. His face, caught on one side of the light coming from the window, the earnestness and timidity written on the face are certainly true to the man I remember, and in this respect, the tortoise has been remarkably honest. Looking at this portrait, you would probably take him to the sort you could confidently elbow aside for an empty tram seat. But then, each of us, it seems, has his own special conceit. If the tortoise's modesty forbade him to disguise his timid nature, it did not prevent him contributing to himself a kind of lofty intellectual air, which I for one have no recollection of. But then, to be fair, I cannot recall any colleague could paint a self-portrait with absolute honesty, however accurate one may feel in the surface details of one's mirror reflection. The personality represented rarely comes near to the truth as one would see it. The tortoise earned his nickname because, joining the firm in the midst of a particularly busy commission, he proceeded to produce only 2 or 3 canvases in the time it took for the rest of us to complete 6 or 7. At first, his slowness was put down to inexperience and the nickname was used only behind his back, but as the weeks went by and his rate has not improved, the bitterness against him grew. It soon became a commonplace for people to call him tortoise to his face. And although he fully realized the name was anything but affectionate, I remember him saying that he's trying his best to take it as though it were. For instance, if someone called across the long room, "Hey, tortoise, are you still painting the petal you began last week?" he would make an effort to laugh as though to share the joke. I recall that my colleagues often attributing this apparent inability to defend his dignity to the fact that the tortoise was from the Negeshi district, for in those days, as today, there prevailed the rather unfair myth that those from that part of the city invariably grew weak and spineless. I remember one morning when Mr. Takeda had left the long room for a moment, 2 or 3 of my colleagues going up to Tortoise's easel and challenging him about his lack of speed. My easel stood not far from his, so I could easily clearly see the nervous expression on his face as he replied, "I beg you to be patient with me. It is my greatest wish to learn from you, my superior colleagues, how to produce works of such quality so quickly. I have done my utmost in the past weeks to paint faster, but sadly I was forced to abandon several pictures because the loss of quality on my account of hurrying was such that I would have disgrace the high standards of our firm. But I will do all I can to improve my poor standing in your eyes, and I beg you to forgive me and to be patient a while longer." The tortoise repeated this plea 2 or 3 times over, while his tormentors persisted with their abuse, accusing him of laziness and of relying on the rest of us to do his share of work. By this time, most of us had ceased to paint and had gathered around. I believe it was after his accusers had begun to abuse the tortoise in particularly harsh terms, and when I saw that the rest of the colleagues would do nothing but to watch with a kind of fascination, that I stepped forward and said, "That's enough. Can't you see you're talking to someone with artistic integrity? If an artist refuses to sacrifice quality for the sake of speed, then that's something we should all respect. You have become fools that you can't see." Of course, this is all a matter of many years ago, and I cannot vouch that those were my exact words that morning. But I spoke in such a way on Tortoise's behalf of that I am quite certain, for I can distinctly recall the gratitude and relief on Tortoise's face as he turned to me, and the astonished stares of all the others present. I, myself, commanded considerable respect among my colleagues, and my own output being unchallengeable in terms either in quality or quantity, and I believe my intervention put an end to the tortoise ordeal, at least for the rest of the morning. You may think that I am taking too much credit in relating this small episode. After all, the point I was making in the tortoise defense seems to be a very obvious one you might think would occur instantly to anyone with any respect for serious art. But it is necessary to remember the climate of those days at Master Takeda's. The feeling amongst us that we were all battling together against time to preserve the hard-earned reputation of the firm. We were also quite aware that the essential point about the sort of things we were commissioned to paint, geishas, cherry trees, swimming cups, temples, was that they looked Japanese to the foreigners to whom they were shipped out to, and all finer points of style were quite likely to go unnoticed. So I do not think that I am claiming undue credit for my younger self if I suggest my action that they were a manifestation of a quality I came to be very much respected for in the later years. The abilities to think and judge for myself, even if it means going against the sway of those around me. The fact remains certainly that I was the only one to come to the tortoise defense that morning. Although the tortoise managed to thank me for that small intervention and for subsequent acts of support, the pace of those days was such that it was some time before I was able to talk to him at length in any intimacy. Indeed, I believe almost 2 months had elapsed since the incident that I have just related, when there came at last something of a lull in our frantic schedule. I was strolling around grounds of Tamagawa Temple, as I often did when I found some spare time, and I spotted Tortoise sitting on the bench in the sunshine, apparently asleep. I remain an enthusiast of the Tamagawa grounds, and would agree that the hedges and the rows of trees to be found there today may indeed help provide an atmosphere more in keeping with a place of worship. But whenever I go there now, I find myself becoming nostalgic for the Tamagawa's grounds as they used to be. In those days, before the hedges and the trees, the ground seems far more extensive and full of life. Scattered all over the open expanse of green, you will see stalls selling candies and balloons, side shows of jugglers and conjurers. The Tamagawa grounds were also the place to go, I remember, if you wanted a photograph made. For you could not stroll far without coming across a photographer cramped in his stall with a tripod and dark cloak. The afternoon I found That afternoon I found the tortoise there was on a Sunday at the start of a spring. Everywhere was busy with parents and children. He woke with a start as I walked over and sat next to him. "Oh, why, Ono-san!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up. "What good fortune to see you today! Why, just a moment ago I was saying to myself, if only I had a little spare money, I would buy something for Ono-san, some token of gratitude for his kindness to me. But for the moment I can only afford some cheap things, and that would be an insult. So in the meantime, Ono-san, let me thank you from my heart for all you have done for me." "I have not done much," I said. "I just spoke my mind a few times, that's all." "But truly, Ono-san, men like you are all too rare. It is an honor to be a colleague of such a man. However much our paths may part in years to come, I'll remember you. I'll always remember your kindness." I recall having to listen for several more moments to his praise of my courage and integrity. Then I said, "I've been meaning to talk to you for some time, you see. I've been thinking things over and I'm considering leaving Master Takeda in the future." The tortoise stared at me in astonishment. Then, comically, he looked about him as though in fear I had been overheard. "I've been very fortunate," I went on. "My work has caught the interest of the painter and printmaker Seiji Moriyama. Have you heard of him, no doubt? You have heard of him, no doubt." The tortoise stared at me, shook his head. Mr. Moriyama," I said, "is a true artist. In all likelihood, a great one. I've been exceptionally fortunate to receive his attention and advice. Indeed, in his opinion that my remaining with Master Takeda will do irreparable harm to my gifts, and he has invited me to become his pupil." "Is that so?" my companion remarked warily. "And you know, as I was strolling through the park just now, I was thinking to myself, of course, Mr. Moriyama is absolutely correct. It's all very well for the rest of those workhorses to toil under Master Takeda to earn their living, but those of us with serious ambition must look elsewhere." At this point, I gave the tortoise a meaningful glance. He continued to stare at me, a puzzled look entering his expression. "I am afraid I took the liberty of mentioning you to Mr. Moriyama," I told him. "In fact, I expressed opinion that you were the exception amongst my present colleagues. You alone, among them, had real talent and serious aspiration." "Really, Ono-san?" He burst into laughter. "How can you say such a thing? I know you mean to be kind to me, but this is going too far. I've made up my mind to accept Mr. Moriyama's kind offer," I continued, "and I urge you to let me show your work to him. With luck, you too may be invited to become his pupil." The tortoise looked at me with distress on his face. Hang on. Stretch. Distress on his face. "But Ono-san, what are you saying?" he said in a lowered voice. "Master Takeda took me on through the recommendations of the most respected acquaintance of my father, and really he has shown me great tolerance despite my problems. How can I be so disloyal as to leave after a few months?" Then suddenly, the tortoise seemed to see the import of his words and added hurriedly, "But of course, Ono-san, I don't imply you are in any way disloyal. Circumstances are different in your case, and I wouldn't presume—" He faded off into embarrassed giggling. Then, with an effort, he pulled himself together to ask, "Are you serious about leaving Master Takeda, Ono-san?" "In my opinion," I said, "Master Takeda doesn't deserve the loyalty of the likes of you and me. Loyalty has to be earned." Oh. Aku bookmark this quote. Loyalty has to be earned. There's too much made of loyalty. All too often men talk about loyalty and follow blindly. I, for one, have no wish to lead my life like that. These, of course, may not have been the precise words I used that afternoon at the Tamagawa's temple, for I have had cause to recount this particular scene many times before, and it is inevitable that with repeated telling, such accounts begin to take on a life of their own. But even if I did not express myself to the tortoise quite so succinctly that day, I think it can be assumed those words I have just attributed to myself do not represent accurately enough my attitude and resolve at that point in my life. One place, incidentally, where I was obliged to tell and retell stories of those days at the Takeda firm was around that table in the Migi Hidari. My pupils seem to share a fascination for hearing about this early part of my career, perhaps because they were naturally interested to learn what their teacher was doing at their age. In any case, the topic of my days with Master Takeda would come up frequently during the course of those evenings. It wasn't such a bad experience, I remember telling them once. It taught me some important things. Forgive me, sensei. I believe it was Kuroda who leaned across the table to say this, but I find it hard to believe a place that, like the one you described, could teach an artist anything useful whatsoever. Yes, sensei, said another voice. Do tell us what a place like that could have possibly taught you. It sounds more like a firm producing cardboard boxes. Yes, wait. This was the way things would go at Migi Hidari. I would be having conversation with someone and the rest of them talking amongst themselves, and as soon as an interesting question had been asked of me, they would all break off their own conversation and I would have a circle of faces awaiting my reply. It was as though they never talked amongst themselves without having an open ear for another piece of knowledge I might impart. This is not to say that they were uncritical, quite the contrary. They were they were a brilliant set of young men, and one would never dare say anything without having first thought about it. Being at Takeda's, I told them, taught me an important lesson early in life, that while it was right to look up to teachers, it was always important to question their authority. Oh, great quote. The Takeda experience taught me never to follow the crowd blindly, but to consider carefully the direction in which I was being pushed. And if there's one thing I have tried to encourage you all to do, it's been to rise above the sway of things, to rise above the undesirable and decadent influences that have swamped us and have done so much so weaken the fiber of our nation the past 10-15 years. No doubt, I was a little drunk and sounded rather grandiose, but that was the way those sessions around the corner table went. Indeed, sensei, someone said. We must all remember that. We must all endeavor to rise above the sway of things. And I think we are here around this table, I went on, have a right to be proud of ourselves. The grotesque and frivolous have been prevalent all around us, and now, at last, a finer, more manly spirit emerging in Japan, and you are here, a part of all of it. In fact, it's my wish that you should go, to become recognized as nothing less than the spearhead of the new spirit, indeed. And by this point, I will be addressing not just those around the table, but those listening nearby. This establishment of ours, where we all gather, is a testimony to the new emerging spirit, and all of us here have a right to be proud. Frequently, as the drinking got merrier, outsiders would come crowding round to our table to join in our arguments and speeches, or simply to listen and soak in the atmosphere. On the whole, my pupils were ready enough to give strangers a hearing, though, of course, if we were imposed on by a bore or by someone with disagreeable views, they would quickly to squeeze them out. But for all the shouting and speech making that went on into the night, the real quarrels were rare at the Migi Hidari. All of us who frequented that place being united by the same essential spirit, that is to say, the establishment proved to be everything Yamagata had wished. It represented something fine, and one could get drunk there with pride and integrity. Pam, pam, pam. Okay. Sip of water. I have somewhere in the house a painting by Kuroda, that most gifted of my pupils, depicting one such evening at the Migi Hidari. It is entitled The Patriotic Spirit, a title that may lead you to expect work depicting soldiers on the march or some sort of thing. Of course, it was Kuroda's very point that a patriotic spirit began somewhere further back in the routine of our daily lives, in such things as where we drank and who we mixed with. It was his tribute, for he believed in such things then, to the spirit of the Migi Hidari. The picture, painted in oils, showed several tables take in much of the color and decor of the place, most noticeably the patriotic banners and slogans suspended from the rails of the upper balcony. Beneath the banners, guests are gathered around in tables in conversation, while in the foreground a waitress in a kimono hurried with a tray of drinks. It is a fine painting, capturing very accurately the boisterous yet somehow proud and respectable atmosphere of the Migi Hidari. And whenever I happen to look at it today, it still brings me a certain satisfaction to recall that I, with whatever influence my reputation had gained in this city, was able to do my small part in bringing such a place into being. Quite often these days, in the evenings, down at Mrs. Kawakami's, I find myself reminiscing about the Migi Hidari and the old days. For there is something about Mrs. Kawakami's place that when Shintaro and I were the only customers there, something about sitting together up at the bar under the low-hung lights that puts us into the nostalgic mood. We may start discussing something about someone from the past, about how much he could drink perhaps, or some funny mannerisms he had. Then before long, we'll be trying to get Mrs. Kawakami to recall the man, and in our attempts to jog her memory, we will find ourselves remembering more and more amusing things about him. The other night, when we had been laughing over such set of reminiscences, Mrs. Kawakami, as often as will do so on this occasion, says, "Well, I don't remember the name, but I'm sure to recognize his face." "Well, in truth, Obasan," I said, remembering, "he was never a real customer here. He used to drink across the street." "Oh, yes, that big place. I still remember if I saw him, I may recognize him. But then again, who knows? People change so much. Every now and then I see someone on the street and I think I know them and that I should greet them. But when I look at them again, I'm not so sure." "Why, Obasan?" Shintaro put in. "Just the other day, I greeted someone in the street thinking that it was someone I knew, but the man obviously thought that I was a madman. He walked away without replying." Shintaro seemed to regard this as an amusing story and laughed loudly. Mrs. Kawakami smiled but did not join in the laughter. Then she turned to me and said, "Sensei, you must try and persuade your friends to start coming back to these parts. In fact, perhaps each time we see an old face from the days, we should be stopping him and telling him to come to this little place. That way we could start rebuilding the old days." "Now, that's a splendid idea, Obasan," I said. "I'll try and remember to do that. I'll stop people in the street and say, 'I remember you from the old days. You used to be a regular around our district.' Well, you may think it's all gone, but you are wrong. Mrs. Kawakami is still there, the same as ever, and things are slowly building back up again." "That's it, Sensei," Mrs. Kawakami said. "You tell them they will be missing out. Business will start to improve then. After all, it's Sensei's duty to bring back the old crowd. Everyone always look up to Sensei as a natural leader around here." "A good point, Obasan," Shintaro said. "In the olden times, if a lord had his troops scattered after a battle, he would soon go about gathering them together again. Sensei in a similar position." "What nonsense," I said, laughing. That's right, Sensei, Mrs. Kawakami went on. You find all the old people here, and you found the old people again and tell them to come back here. Then, after a while, I'll buy the place next door and we'll open up a grand old place, just like the big places used to be. Indeed, Sensei, Shintaro was still saying, a lord must gather his men again. An interesting idea, Oba-san, I said, nodding. And you know, the Migi Hidari was just a small place once, no bigger than this one here. But then, in time, we managed to turn it into what it was. Well, perhaps we'll just have to do the same thing again with this place of yours. Now things are settling a little. The custom ought to be coming back. You could bring in all your artist friends again, Sensei, Mrs. Kawakami said. Then before long, all the newspaper men will follow. An interesting idea. We could probably pull it off, except I wonder, Oba-san. You may not be able to handle such a big place. We wouldn't want you to get out of your depth. Nonsense, Mrs. Kawakami said, putting up an offended look. If Sensei will hurry up and do his part, you will see how well things will be managed around here. Recently, we have had such a conversation over and over. And who is to say the old district will not return again? The likes of Mrs. Kawakami and I, we may tend to make a joke about it, but behind our bantering, there is a thread of serious optimism. A lord must gather his men, and so he should. Perhaps, when Noriko's future is once and for all settled, I will give some serious consideration to Mrs. Kawakami's schemes. I suppose I might mention here that I have seen my former protege, Kuroda, just once since the end of the war. It was quite by chance on a rainy morning during the first year of the occupation, before the Migi Hidari and all the other buildings had been demolished. I was walking somewhere, making my way through what was left of our old pleasure district, looking from under my umbrella all the skeletal remains I remember, where there were workmen wandering around that day, and so at first I paid no attention to the figure standing looking at one of the burnt out buildings. It was only as I walked by that I became aware the figure had turned and was watching me. I paused, then looked around, and through the rain dripping off my umbrella, I saw the strange shocked Kuroda looking expressionlessly towards me. Beneath his umbrella, he was hatless and dressed in a dark raincoat. The charred building behind him were dripping, and the remnants of some gutter was making a large amount of rainwater splash down not far from him. I remember a truck going by between us, full of building workers, and I noticed how one of the spokes of his umbrella was broken, causing some more splashing just beside his foot. Kuroda's face had been quite round before the war, had hollowed out the cheekbones, and what looked like heavy lines had appeared towards the chin and the throat. And I thought to myself as I stood there, he's not young anymore. He moved his head very slightly. I was not sure if it was to the beginning of a bow, or he was just adjusting his head to get out of the splash of the rainwater from his broken umbrella. Then he turned and began to walk off in the other direction. But it was not my intention to dwell on Kuroda here. Indeed, he would not be in my mind at all had his name not turned up so unexpectedly last month during the chance meeting on the tram with Dr. Saito. It was the afternoon I eventually took Ichiro to see the monster film, a trip that he has been denied the previous day by Noriko's stubbornness. In fact, my grandson and I went ourselves, Noriko refusing to come and Setsuko again volunteering to remain at home. It was, of course, a simple childishness on Noriko's part, but Ichiro had his own interpretation of the women's behavior. As we sat down to lunch that day, he continued to say, "Aunt Noriko and mother aren't coming. It's much too scaring for women. Too scaring for women. They will be much too scared, isn't that, Oji-san?" "Yes, I expect that's right, Ichiro. They would be much too scared. Aunt Noriko You'd be far too scared to see the film, wouldn't you? Ah, yes, Noriko said, pulling a frightened face. Even Oji-san is scared. Look, you can see even Oji-san is scared. He's a man. That afternoon, as I was standing at the end of the entryway waiting to leave for the cinema, I witnessed a curious scene between Ichiro and his mother. While Setsuko was strapping up his sandals, I could see my grandson continually trying to say something to her. But whenever Setsuko said, "What is it, Ichiro? I can't hear," he would glare angrily and then cast a quick glance towards me to see if I had heard. Finally, once the sandal had been put on, Setsuko bent down so that Ichiro could appear into her ear. She then nodded and disappeared into the house, returning a moment later with a raincoat, which she folded and handed to him. "It's unlikely to rain," I remarked, looking out beyond the front entrance. Indeed, it was a fine day out. "All the same," Setsuko said, "Ichiro would like to take it with him." I was puzzled by his insistence on the raincoat. Then, once we were out in the sunshine and making our way down the hill towards the tram stop, I noticed the swagger with which Ichiro walked. Although the raincoat slung through his arm had transformed him into someone like Humphrey Bogart, and concluded it was all in an imitation of some comic book hero of his. I suppose we were almost at the bottom of the hill when Ichiro declared loudly, "Oji-san, you used to be a famous artist." "I expect that's right, Ichiro. I told Aunt Noriko to show me Oji-san's pictures, but she won't show me." They're all tidied up away just for the moment." "Aunt Noriko is disobedient, isn't she, Oji-san? I told her to show me Oji-san's picture. Why won't she show me?" I laughed and said, "I don't know, Ichiro. Perhaps she was busy with something." "She's disobedient." I gave another laugh, saying, "I suppose so, Ichiro." The tram stop is 10 minutes walk from our house and down the hill to the river, then a little walk along the new concrete embankment, and the northbound circuit joins the road just beyond the site of the new housing scheme. That sunny afternoon last month, my grandson and I boarded there for the city center, and it was on that journey we encountered Dr. Saito. I realize I have said very little so far about the Saito family, the eldest son of which presently involved in marriage talks with Noriko. The Saitos, all in all, in very different sorts of prospect from the Miyakes of last year. The Miyakes were all, of course, decent people, but they could not, in all fairness, be called a family of any prestige, whereas the Saito family, without exaggeration, is just that. In fact, although Dr. Saito and I were not properly acquainted before, I had always known of his activities in the world of arts, and for years, whenever we had passed on the street, we had exchanged greetings politely to acknowledge our familiarity with each other's reputation. But of course, in the occasion on which we met last month, things had become very different. The tram does not become crowded until it has crossed the river at the steel bridge opposite Tanibashi station, and so, when Dr. Saito boarded one stop after us, he was able to take a vacant seat beside me. Inevitably, our conversation began a little uncomfortably, for the negotiation was still at an early stage, delicate stage, and it did not seem proper to discuss them openly, but then it would have been absurd to pretend they were not going on. In the end, we both praised the merits of our mutual friend, Mr. Kyo, the go-between in the proposal, and Dr. Saito remarked with a smile, "Let us hope his efforts bring us together again shortly." And that was as close as we came to discussing the matter. I could not help noticing the marked contrast between the assured way Dr. Saito had responded to the slightly awkward situation and the nervous and clumsy way the Miyake family had handled things from start to finish last year. Whatever the eventual outcome, one does not feel reassured to be dealing with the likes of the Saito family. Otherwise, we talk mainly of small things. Dr. Saito has a warm, genial manner, and when he leaned forward to ask Ichiro how he was enjoying his visit and about the movie we were about to see, my grandson showed no inhibition about conversing with him. A fine boy, Dr. Saito said to me approvingly. It was short after he stopped. He had already put on his hat back on that Dr. Saito remarked, "We have another mutual acquaintance, a certain Mr. Kuroda." I looked at him, a little startled. "Mr. Kuroda?" I repeated. "Ah, no doubt. That would be the same gentleman I once supervised. That's right. I came across him recently and he happened to mention your name." "Is that so? I haven't come across him for a long time. Not since before the war, certainly. How is Mr. Kuroda these days? What is he up to?" "I believe he's about to take up an appointment at the new Uemachi College, where he will teach art. This was how I came across him. I was kindly asked by the college to advise on the appointments board." "Ah, so you don't know Mr. Kuroda well?" "Indeed not, but I hope to see more of him in the future." "Is that so?" I said. "So Mr. Kuroda still remembers me. How good of him." "Yes, indeed. He mentioned your name when we happened to be discussing something. I have not had the opportunity to talk with him at any length, but should I meet him again, I will mention that I saw you." "Ah, indeed." The tram was crossing the street, the steel bridge, and the wheels made to loud clanging voice. Ichiro, who had been kneeling on his seat to see outside the window, pointed out something down in the water. Dr. Saito turned to look, exchanged a few more words with Ichiro, then got onto his feet as his stop approached. He made a last allusion to the efforts of Mr. Kyo before bowing and making his way to the exit. As usual, many people crowded on the stop at the stop after the bridge, and the rest of our journey was rather uncomfortable. When we got off in front of the cinema, I could see the poster prominently displayed at the entrance. My grandson had achieved a close likeness in his sketch of 2 days earlier, though there were no fire in the picture. What Ichiro had remembered were the impact lines, resembling streaks of lightning, which the artist had painted in to emphasize the ferocity of the giant lizard. Ichiro went up to the poster and burst out into loud laughter. "It's so easy, that's a made-up monster," he said, pointing. "Anyone could see that, it's just made up." And he laughed again. "Ichiro, please don't laugh so loudly. Everyone's looking at you." "But I can't help it. The monster looks so made up. Who would be so scared of that thing?" It was only once we were seated inside and the film had begun I discovered the true purpose of his raincoat. 10 minutes into the film, we heard ominous music and on the screen appeared a dark cave with mist swirling about it. Ichiro whispered, "This is boring. Will you tell me when something interesting starts to happen?" And with that, he threw the raincoat over his head, and a few moments later there was a roar, and the giant lizard emerged from the cave. Ichiro's other hand was holding the raincoat in place tightly as possible. The coat continued to cover his head for more or less the whole duration of the film. Occasionally, my arms would be shaken, and a voice would ask from underneath, "Is it getting interesting yet?" I would be then obliged to describe in whispers what was on the screen until a small gap appeared in the raincoat. But within minutes, the slightest hint that the monster would reappear, the gap would close, and his voice would say, "This is so boring. Don't forget to tell me when it gets interesting." When we got home, though, Ichiro was full of enthusiasm for the film. "It's the best movie I've ever seen," he continued to say, and he was still giving us his version of it when we sat down for supper. "Aunt Noriko, I shall tell you what happened next." "It gets very scary, shall I tell you?" "I'm getting so frightened, Ichiro, I can hardly eat," Noriko said. "I'm warning you, it gets even more frightening." "Shall I tell you more?" Oh, I'm not so sure, Ichiro. You've got me so frightened already. It had been it had not been my intention to make heavy talk at the supper table by bringing up Dr. Saito, then it would have been unnatural not to mention our meeting when recounting the day's event. So when Ichiro paused for a moment, I said, "Incidentally, we met Dr. Saito on the tram. He was traveling up to see someone." When I said this, my two daughters both stopped eating and looked at me with surprise. "But we didn't talk about anything significant," I said with a small laugh. "Really, we just exchanged pleasantries, that's all." My daughter seemed unconvinced, but they began to eat again. Noriko glanced over to her eldest sister, then Setsuko said, "Dr. Saito was well?" "He appeared to be." We ate on quietly for a while. Perhaps Ichiro began to talk about the movie again. In any case, it was a little later in the meal that I said, "An odd thing. It turns out that Dr. Saito met a former pupil of mine, Kuroda, in fact. It seemed that Kuroda was taking up..." "Hey, Ophelia, Dad, thank you so much for being here. Thank you." I looked up from my bowl and saw my daughters again stop eating. It was clear they had just exchanged glances, and it was one of those instances last month when I got a distinct impression they had at some point been discussing certain things about me. That night, my two daughters and I were sitting around the table again, reading our newspapers and magazines, when we were disturbed by a dull thudding noise coming rhythmically from somewhere within the house. Noriko looked up in alarm, but Setsuko said, "It's just Ichiro. He does that when he cannot fall asleep." "Poor Ichiro," Noriko said. "I expect he keeps dreaming of the monster. It was so wicked of father to take him to see a film like that." "Nonsense," I said. "He enjoyed it. I think father just wanted to see it himself." Noriko said to her sister again, "Poor Ichiro, being dragged along to see a nasty film like that." Setsuko turned towards me with an embarrassed look. "It was so kind of father to take Ichiro," she murmured. "But now he can't sleep," Noriko said. "Ridiculous to take him to see a film like that." "No, you stay, Setsuko, I'll go." Setsuko watched her sister leave the room and then said, "Noriko is so good with children. Ichiro will miss her when we are home." "Yes, indeed. She's always so good with children. Do you remember, father, how she used to play those games with Kinoshita's little children?" "Yes, indeed," I said with a laugh, and then I added, "The Kinoshita's boys are far too big these days to want to come around here." "She's always been so good with children," Setsuko repeated. "How sad to see her reach this age and still unmarried." Indeed, the war came at a bad time for her. For a few moments, we continued with our reading. Then Setsuko said, "It was fortuitous to have met Dr. Saito on the train this afternoon. He sounds like an admirable gentleman." "He is indeed. From all accounts, the son is well worthy of his father." "Is that so?" Setsuko said thoughtfully. We returned to our reading a few more moments. Then my daughter again broke his silence, and Dr. Saito is acquainted with Mr. Kuroda? "Only slightly," I said, not looking up from my paper. "It seems they met somewhere. I wonder how Mr. Kuroda is these days. I can remember how he used to come here, and you would talk together for hours in the reception room." I have no idea about Kuroda these days. Forgive me, but I wonder if it may not be wise if father were to visit Mr. Kuroda soon." "Visit him?" "Mr. Kuroda, and perhaps certain other such acquaintances from the past." "I'm not sure I follow what you're saying, Setsuko. Forgive me, I simply meant that to suggest that father may wish to speak to certain acquaintances from his past. That is to say, before the Saito's detective does. After all, we do not wish any unnecessary misunderstanding to arise." "No, I suppose we don't," I said, returning to my paper. "Neither I believe we did not discuss this matter further than that. Neither did Setsuko raise it again for the remainder of her stay last month. Yesterday, as I took the tram down to Arakawa, the carriage was filled with bright autumn sunshine. I did not make I had not made the journey to Arakawa for a little while. In fact, not since the end of the war. And as I gazed out of my window, I noticed many changes in what had once been a familiar scenery. Passing through the Tozakacho and Sakaimachi, I could see brick apartments blocks looming above the small wooden houses I remembered from before. Then, as we passed the backs of the factories in Minamimachi, I saw how abandoned many of them had become. One factory yard went after another, untidily stacked from broken timber, old sheets of corrugated metals, and often what looked to be plain rubble. But then, after the tram line crosses the river at the THK Corporation Bridge, the atmosphere changes dramatically. You are traveling amidst fields and trees, and before long, the suburb of Arakawa will become visible at the bottom of the long steep hill where the tram line ends. The tram will move very slowly down the hill, then brake to a halt, and as you step out onto those cleanly swept pavements, you will be overcome by the distinct feeling you have left the city behind. Arakawa, I have heard, completely escaped the bombings, and indeed, yesterday the place looked just as it had always done. A short walk up the hill, pleasantly shaded by the cherry trees, brought me to Chishu Matsuda's house, and that too was quite unchanged. Matsuda's house, not large nor full of eccentricity. Oh my god, I'm dying. Not as large or full of eccentricity as my own, is typical of the sort of solid, respectable house to be found in Arakawa. It stands on its own ground, circled by a board fence at reasonable distance from the neighboring properties. At the gateway, there is a bush of azaleas and a thick post sunk in the background, giving the family inscriptions. I pulled the bell and was answered by a woman of around 40 whom I did not recognize. She showed me into the veranda room, where she slid back into the screen of the veranda, allowing the sun to enter and giving me a glimpse of the garden outside. Then she left me saying, "Mr. Matsuda will not be a moment." I first met Matsuda while living at Seiji Moriyama's villas, where the tortoise and I had gone after leaving the Takeda firm. In fact, when Matsuda first came to the villa that day, I must already have been living there for 6 years. It had been raining throughout the morning, and a group of us had been passing the time drinking and playing cards in one of the rooms. Then, shortly after lunch, just as we had opened another large bottle, we heard a stranger's voice calling out in the yard. The voice was strong and assured, and we all of us fell silent and looked at each other in panic. For the fact was we had all leapt into the same thought, and that the police had come to reprimand us. This was of course an utterly irrational idea, for we had not committed any sort of crime, and had, say, someone challenged our lifestyle during a conversation in a bar, any of us would have been able to put up with a spirited defense on its behalf. But that firm voice calling, "Anyone home?" had caught us unawares, causing us to betray our sense of guilt concerning our late nights of drinking, the way we slept through many of our mornings, the way we lived in a life without routine in a decaying villa. It was some moments before one of our companions nearest to the screen opened it, exchanged a few words with the caller, and then turned and said, "Oh no, a gentleman wishes to speak with you." I went out to the veranda to find a lean-featured young man of around my age standing in the middle of the large square yard. I have retained a vivid picture of that first time I saw Matsuda. The rain had stopped and the sun was out. All around him were puddles of water and wet leaves fallen from the cedar tree overlooking the villa. He was dressed too dandyish to be a policeman. His overcoat was sharply tailored with a high upturned collar, and he wore his hat slanted down over his eyes in somewhat mocking manner. As I emerged, he was glancing around with an interest at his surrounding, and something in the way he did this immediately suggested to me that the first time I saw him, Matsuda's arrogant nature. He saw me and came hurriedly towards the veranda. "Mr. Ono?" I asked what I could do for him. He turned, cast his eyes around the grounds again, and then smiled at me. "An interesting place. This must have been a grand building once, owned by a lord of some sort." "Indeed. Mr. Ono, my name is Chisu Matsuda. We have in fact been in correspondence. I worked for the Okada Shingen Society." The Okada Shingen Society no longer exists today, one of many such victims of occupying forces, but quite possibly you will have heard of it, or at least of the exhibition it held each year until the war. The Okada Shingen exhibition was for a time principal means of the city by which artists emerging in paintings and printmaking came to win public acclaim. Indeed, such was its reputation that in its latter years, most of the city's leading artists were displaying their latest works there alongside with those of the newer talents. It was in connection with this same exhibition that the Okada Shingen Society had written to me a few weeks prior to the afternoon of Matsuda's visit. "I was made a little curious by your reply, Mr. Ono," Matsuda said, "so I thought I would call by and discover what it was all about." I looked at him coldly, and I said I believe I made all the necessary points in my letter of reply. It was, however, most kind of you to have approached me. A slight smile appeared around his eyes. "Mr. Ono," he said, "it seems to me that you are foregoing an important opportunity to enhance your reputation. So please tell me, when you insist you wish to have nothing to do with us, is that your own personal opinion, or is it that your teacher happened to decree?" "Naturally, I sought my teacher's advice. I am perfectly confident that the decision conveyed in my recent letter is the correct one. It was very good of you to come out here, but unfortunately I am occupied at this moment and cannot ask you to step up. I will therefore bid you a good day." "One moment, please, Mr. Ono," Masuda said, his smile looking ever more mocking. He took a few more steps, coming right up to the veranda, looking up at me. "To be frank, I am not bothered about the exhibition. There are many more artists worthy of it. I came here, Mr. Ono, because I wish to meet you." "Really? How good of you." "Indeed. I wish to say that I am very struck by what I have seen of your work. I believe you have very much talent. You are most kind. No doubt I owe much of the excellence of my teacher's guidance. No doubt. Now, Mr. Ono." Hello, Azorakians. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. "No doubt. Now, Mr. Ono, let us forget this exhibition. You must appreciate I do not merely work for the Okada Shingen as a kind of clerk. I am a true lover of work of art. I have my beliefs and passion, and when every once in a while I come across a talent that truly excites me, then I feel I must do something about it. I would very much like to discuss certain ideas with you, Mr. Ono. Ideas which may never have occurred to you before, but which I modestly suggest will be of benefit to your development as an artist. But I'll keep you no longer for the moment. Let me at least leave you my calling card." He took his card from his wallet, placed it on the edge of the veranda, and then, with a quick bow, took his leave. But before he was halfway across the yard, he turned and called to me. "Please consider my request carefully, Mr. Ono. I merely wish to discuss certain ideas with you, that's all." That was almost 13 years ago, when we were both young and ambitious. Yesterday, Matsuda looked a very different man. His body has become broken down with ill health, and his once handsome, arrogant face has become distorted by a lower jaw that seems to no longer able to align itself with the upper. The woman who had answered the door to me helped him into the room and assisted him to sit down. When we are alone, Matsuda looked at me and said, "You seem to have preserved your health well. As for myself, you can see I've deteriorated even further since our last meeting." I expressed sympathy, but stated I did not look as bad as that. I stated that he did not look as bad as all that. "Don't try to fool me, Ono," he said with a smile. "I know exactly how feeble I'm growing. There's little to be done, apparently. I have to just wait and see if my body recovers, or else goes on getting worse. Still, enough about such cheerless matter. This is something of a surprise to have you visit me again. I suppose we didn't part on the easiest terms." "Really? But I wasn't aware that we quarreled." "Of course not. Why would we quarrel? I'm glad you have come to see me again. It must have been 3 years since we last met each other." "I believe so. It wasn't my intention to avoid you. I've been meaning to for some time to come out and pay a visit, but what with one thing and another." "Naturally," he said. "You had a lot to attend to. You must forgive me, of course, for failing to attend Michiko-san's funeral. I had meant to write and express my apologies. The fact of the matter is I didn't hear what had occurred until several days later. And then, of course, my own health." Naturally. Indeed, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed by a large, ostentatious ceremony. In any case, she would have known your thoughts and would have been with her. I can remember when you and Michiko-san were brought together." He laughed and nodding to himself. "I was very happy for you that day, Ono." "Indeed," I've said, also laughing. "You're to all intents our go-between. That uncle of yours just couldn't cope with the job." "That's right," Matsuda said, smiling. "You're bringing it all back to me. He would get so embarrassed. He couldn't say or do anything without flushing scarlet. You remember the marriage meeting at the Yanagi-machi Hotel?" We both laughed, and then I said, "You did a lot on our behalf. I doubt it would have been brought off without you. Michiko always thought of you with gratitude." "A cruel thing," Matsuda said, sighing. "And with the war..."
Stretch.
"Thank you." Okay, good stretch.
I could never know how long I can read, how long a chapter is. Always go past my hours, but it's okay. It's okay. And with the war all but over, I heard it was something of a freak raid. Indeed, hardly anyone else was hurt, as you would say, a cruel thing. But I'm bringing back terrible thoughts. I'm sorry. Not at all. It's something of a comfort to remember her with you. Remember her back in the old days then. Indeed. Oh my goodness. Morning. Morning. Or good afternoon where I am. Thank you so much for being here. I think we are a few pages. Oh, okay. Yeah, almost done with this chapter. We are currently reading An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro, the first chapter. They don't call it chapter, they just call it October 1948. So we are at page 91 of October 1948. And we are about 5 pages to finish this so-called chapter. And
I thank you in advance for your patience, for listening to me. And if you have missed out on the beginning of the story, which is about 90 pages of them, please watch my VOD. It will be available as soon as I end the stream. Thank you so much. Now we shall continue page 91 of An Artist of the Floating World, October 1948. The woman brought in the tea. As she was laying down the tray, Matsuda said to her, Miss Suzuki, this is an old colleague of mine. We were very close once. She turned to me and bowed. Miss Suzuki doubles as my housekeeper and nurse, Matsuda said. She's responsible for the fact that I am still breathing. Miss Suzuki gave a laugh, bowed again, and took a leave. A few moments after she had gone, Matsuda and I sat quietly, both gazing out between the screens Miss Suzuki had opened earlier. From where I sat, a pair of straw sandals were visible, left outside on the veranda in the sun. But I could not see much of the garden itself, and for a moment I felt tempted to rise up to my feet and to go out on the veranda, but realizing Matsuda would wish to accompany me and find difficulty in doing so, I remained seated, wondering to myself if the garden was as it had been. As I remembered it, Matsuda's garden, though small, was arranged with much taste, a floor of smooth moss, a few small shapely trees, and a deep pond. While sitting with Matsuda, I had caught an occasional splashing sound coming from the outside. I was about to ask him if he still kept carp when he said, I wasn't exaggerating when I told you Miss Suzuki was responsible for my life. She has been quite crucial on more than one occasion. You see, oh no, despite everything, I managed to hold on to some savings and assets. As a result, I am able to employ her. Not so lucky for some others. I'm not exactly wealthy, but then, if I knew an old colleague was in difficulties, I would do what I could to assist. After all, I have no children to leave money to. I gave a laugh. Say more, Matsuda. Very forthright. It's kind of you. But that's not what brought me here. I too managed to hold on to my assets. Ah, I'm pleased to hear that. You remember Nakane, the principal at Minami Imperial College? I've seen him from time to time. This day, he's a little better than a beggar. Of course, he tried to keep up appearances, but he lives entirely off borrowed money. How terrible. Some very unjust things have occurred, Matsuda said. Still, we both managed to hold on to our assets. And you have more reasons to be thankful, Ono. You appear to have held on to your health too. Indeed, I said. I have much to be thankful for. Again, a splashing sound came from the pond outside, and it occurred to me that it could be birds but bathing at the water's edge. Your garden sounds distinctly different to mine, I remarked. I can tell just listening to it that we are out of the city. Is that so? I hardly remember what the city sounds like. This has been the extent of my work for the past few years, this house and this garden. As a matter of fact, I did come to ask your help, but not in the way you implied earlier. I see you have taken offense, he said, nodding. Much the same as ever. We both laughed, and then he said, So what can I do for you? The fact is, I said, Noriko, my younger daughter, is at this moment involved in marriage talks. Is that so? To be frank, I am a little concerned for her. She's already 26. The war made things difficult for her. Otherwise, there's no doubting she would have been married by now. I believe I recall Miss Noriko, but she was just a little girl. 26 already, as you say. The war has made things difficult even for the best prospects. She was almost married last year, I said, but the talks fell through at the last moment. I wonder, while we are on the subject, did anyone approach you last year concerning Noriko? I don't mean to be impertinent, but not impertinent in the least. I quite understand. But no, I never spoke to anyone. But then, I was very ill this time last year. If some detective had appeared, Miss Suzuki would no doubt would have sent him away. I nodded and said, it's just possible someone may call on you this year. Oh? Well, I've only have the best things to say about you. After all, we were good colleagues once. I'm very grateful. It's good for you to have called like this, he said. But so far as Miss Noriko's marriage is concerned, it was quite unnecessary. I may not have parted on We may not have parted on the easiest terms, but things like this shouldn't have come between us. Naturally, I'll say only the best things about you. I didn't doubt it, I said. You were always a generous man. Still, if it's brought us together again, I'm glad. With some effort, Matsuda reached forward and began to refill our cups. Forgive me, Ono, he said eventually, but you still seem uneasy about something. I do? Forgive me for putting it so bluntly, but the fact is very soon Miss Suzuki will be coming in to warn me I should retire. I'm afraid I'm not able to entertain guests for prolonged periods, not even old colleagues. Of course, I'm very sorry. It's most inconsiderate of me. Don't be ridiculous, Ono. You can't go for a while yet. I was saying this because you came here with a particular point to raise. It would be best if you would do it so soon. Suddenly she burst into laughter, saying, Really, you look aghast at my bad manner. Not at all. It's the most it is most inconsiderate of me. But the truth is, I came simply to talk about my daughter's marriage prospects. I see. But I suppose, I continued, it was my intention to mention certain eventualities. You see, the present negotiation may be quite delicate in nature. I'll be extremely beholden to you if you would answer my queries, which may come your way with delicacy. Of course. His gaze was on me, and there was a touch of amusement in his eyes. With utmost delicacy. Particularly, that is, with regards to the past. But I've said already, Matsuda said, and his voice had become a little colder. I've only the best of things to report of you from the past. Of course. Matsuda continued to look at me for a while, and then he sighed. I've hardly moved from this house for the last 3 years, he said. But I still keep my ears open for what's happening in the country of ours. I realize there are now those who would condemn the likes of you and me for the very things we were once proud to achieve. And I suppose this is why you are worried, or no? You think perhaps I will praise you for the things perhaps best forgotten? No such thing, I said hastily. You and I have a lot to be proud of. It's merely that where marriage talks are concerned, one has to appreciate the delicacy of the situation. But you have put my mind at rest. I know you will exercise your judgment as well as ever. I will do my best, Matsuda said. But oh no, there are things we should be proud of. Never mind what people today are all saying. Before long, a few more years, the likes of us will be able to hold our heads high about what we tried to do. I simply hope I live as long as that. It's my wish to see my life's efforts vindicated. Of course, I feel quite the same. But in respect to marriage negotiations, naturally, Matsuda broke in, I'll do my best to exercise delicacy. I bowed, and we fell silent for a moment. Then he said, But tell me, oh no, if that's the case that you are worried about the past, I assume you have been visiting a few of the others from those days. In fact, you're the first I've come to. I've no idea where many of our old friends are these days. What about Kuroda? I hear he's living in the city somewhere. Is that so? I haven't been in touch with him since the war. If we are worrying about Miss Noriko's future, perhaps you'd best seek him out, painful as it may be. Indeed, it's simply that I have no idea where he is. I see. Hopefully the detective will be equally as lost as to where to find him. But then, sometimes those detectives can be rather resourceful. Indeed. Oh no, you look deathly pale, and you look so healthy when you arrived. That's what comes of sharing a room with a sickly man. I laughed and said, not at all. It's just that one's children can be a great worry. Matsuda sighed again and said, people sometimes tell me I've missed out on life because I never married and never had children. But when I look around me, children seem to be nothing but worry. That's not far from the truth. Still, he said, it would be a comfort to think one had children to leave one's assets to. Indeed. A few moments later, as Matsuda had predicted, Miss Suzuki came in and said something to him. Matsuda smiled and said in resignation, my nurse has come to fetch me. Of course, you're welcome to remain here as long as you wish, but you must excuse me, Ono. Later, as I waited at the terminus for a tram to take me up to the steep hill and back into the city, I felt a certain comfort in recalling Matsuda's assurance that he would have only the best things to report from the past. Of course, I could have been more reasonably confident of this without having gone to visit him. But then again, it is always good to re-establish contact with an old colleague. All in all, yesterday's trip to Arakawa was surely well worthwhile. And that is the end of October 1948, a chapter from An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. We shall continue the next chapter, April 1949, next Monday. And I think we probably can finish it on next Monday, because it's a little bit more than half the book. Probably I'll finish it around like 3 o'clock, I think, for the next reading session. But yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening to my reading. I like this book. The prose, the writing, the everything is very smooth. I have been reading translated books for a long time that I forgot how nice it is to read a book that is written. Oh, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. To read a book that is written in English, basically. Thank you. So yes, yeah, he's such a good writer. That's all I can say. Kazuo Ishiguro is such an amazing writer. I'm not just talking about, like, sometimes you guys forget about, like, we focus too much about the story, but we don't appreciate how the story is being written. He's such an amazing writer. Like, when you read the book, right, there's just a smoothness, the flow to it that's like just perfect for me. And I've been like reading a lot of translated books about from Natsume Soseki and other Japanese writers, that I forgot how nice it is actually to be reading a book that is like that is written in English, and despite having, I'm not sure why, but this is an American printed version of the book. I had this book for the longest time. It's a great book. So far, I'm really liking it. It's really good. Like, I like Kazuo Ishiguro's books. He's very good at writing. He has good characters. Very intriguing characters to like follow their lives. Like, you know, like try to find out more things about them and all that. Always very interesting characters. He very often write in first person view, and it never felt it it really felt like narcissistic. You know, his characters are very rarely like narcissistic. Here I am going to bring out a foe of mine. I fucking hate Haruki Murakami. Haruki Murakami's characters are always like super narcissistic and incel. That's why I hate them. I will never read them. But anyway, Kazuo Ishiguro is very very good writer. I have plenty of books. I have so many books from Natsume Soseki and Kazuo Ishiguro that I think I can run like a reading I can run a Noodible for the entire year with whatever that I have. But I will try to put in other writers in between them. Like for a while I put in other writers in between Soseki and Ishiguro. That now I'm trying to concentrate back to Ishiguro and Soseki. So last week we read Soseki's Watchan, which is quite good, but I still like Kokoro more. The next book that we are going to read is Kusamakura by Soseki. So I'm like trying to like throw around Soseki and Ishiguro a bit. Most of them are like period pieces, like period stories, like based in like 100 years ago in Japan or during the wartime. Like this one is this is after the wartime, like after the Second World War. I think the next time I'm going to read a Kazuo Ishiguro book is going to be in a bit more of the present, in the modern world. So I hope that you guys will enjoy that too. But overall, I am definitely not running out of books from both Kazuo Ishiguro and Natsume Soseki to read. There are still some Natsume Soseki books that I haven't bought yet too. So yeah. And I still remember how ambitious I was last year to start Natsume Soseki's I Am a Cat. That is a monster of a book. There's like 3 volumes of books with like multiple chapters. It's insane, and that was really insane. But towards the end of it, or so, there were not towards the end. I would say like in the midst of like reading the book and towards the end, people got so intrigued with the story that they just continued and finish up the story with me, which I really really appreciate. Like I truly appreciate all of you for being here and listening to my reading. I hope I'm doing a good job reading. I hope that I am not a bad reader. I hope that I hope that I'm doing the books justice, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to read as clearly as possible, but sometimes it's like a bit difficult because sometimes I do find myself rushing a sentence. So but recently I think recently I got a little bit better. Thank you so much. Recently I got a bit better. I really must try to read slower. Thank you. Thank you for the follow. Thank you. Now you're a part of the C team of Final Fantasy VIII. Yeah, I keep rushing. Sometimes I keep rushing a sentence, and I get the letters. Like I don't know. Maybe it's like I don't want to say dyslexic. I don't think I am. But sometimes when I look at a sentence, and then the words get jumbled up, that's when I like read like the last word of the sentence. That's when I screw things up, basically. So I must be very careful. I must read. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Yeah, I need to like.
thank you, Alfuro, for the follow. Thank you so much. We are very close to 140. Um, and I hope to continue growing this channel. I still don't know what I'm going to do besides doing Noodibles. I I did I did stream um, every main scenario quest that I could stream. Um, that's starting from Endwalker basically. In the beginning, I don't have my voice talking or reading the script or whatever, but I did stream MSQ. But maybe later on I'll start streaming like playing other games than just doing Noodibles. But I'm very very happy that you guys are interested in like listening to me read, and interested in the books that I like to read. I'm truly truly grateful for that. And for that, I am going to retire for the day. I'm gonna do my work, and then I'm gonna have my lunch, and I'll see you guys very soon. Thank you so much once again for being here with me. I really, 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 really thankful and grateful. And thank you so much. Hello, Static Casters. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye bye. I'll see you guys on next Monday. Bye.